Hey everybody, it's Eric Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today joined by a very special guest, Jose Luis Ricon Fernandez de la Puente. Jose, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jose, you are currently at Twitter, but I am interested in talking to you in the capacity of your research, of which you research longevity, you research innovation, economics, the entrepreneurial state of science, lots of other topics. Before we get into longevity, how do you sort of define your interests, or what would you edit to my sort of bio of you? Like how do you describe the research that you do, and what is the thread that ties everything together?
Yeah, I mean, for some people, if, for example, if you think of, let's say, Laura Deming, what comes to mind is like longevity. She has been thinking and investing in the area for like years now. In my case, if you look at my things, I think you did a good job in describing the many things I've done. I also have another major thing I did in the past was to do I wrote this small book on the economic history of the Soviet Union, which has nothing to do with longevity. So the key driver of the things I do, it's mostly that they find either their ideas that people repeat that they take as granted. They are usually not explicitly stated in regular discourse, but they're kind of in the background, undisputed. And so I wonder, is this actually correct? Is this thing people assume actually right? And so I go into those things. Now, historically, some of these things are kind of all over the place because I'm a really curious person. And I'm trying lately to kind of focus on concrete areas to try to see if I can go a bit more deeper into that. As for how do I choose in particular at one moment in time what to look at, sometimes I go. Some people have like a posted list of questions. Like Patrick Collison famously has this list of questions, and one of them, for example, was about the so-called Bloom's two sigma effect. And so I went into this list and said, okay, let's answer this question. Sometimes I see people talking about something, and it's like, I want to learn more about this. Or sometimes I just find that in a way the introductory material or the basics for something is not there. Let's say I wrote this FAQ for longevity, and I was dissatisfied with the existing material that was out there. Like there's so much literature and so many connections you can make, and I didn't find anything that you could just give to someone and say, okay, this one thing is everything you need to know about the topic. You don't need to look anywhere else. You need to talk to anyone else. The idea is to try to aggregate all knowledge, everything from academia, like random Twitter threads between scientists, Reddit comments, Quora, everything, to try to give a unified view of one given topic. And in a way, my metric of success is that if people don't reply back, if people don't comment on what I've said, it means it's good, because it means that there is nothing left to be added to what I said.
No. And when you look, so I sort of asked you to describe the thread that ties together, currently and historically. When you look into the future, like if we're looking at your Wikipedia page or something, what do you want to have accomplished or contributed to, or that to that page to say? What do you want to have done?
Yeah, I think that is going to probably talk about either a combination of three things, which are improving science, biotechnology. I think that more like this year compared to previous years, I think that probably biology is an area I should probably actually commit to for the future. So that's that science, biology, and probably with some skewed towards more the computational side, perhaps something like that. So, for example, maybe one idea of success I may say is to, for example, to participate, head or found some organization that is kind of like DARPA for aging, some organization that kind of pulls together different streams of research in the way that I like to do, and actually coordinates researchers to actually achieve their goals in a more effective way.
Yeah. And why doesn't that exist today? Or why don't we sort of segue into sort of like government programs that used, like the Manhattan Project and things that used to be super effective? Could something like that happen today? Or what are the biggest bottlenecks there? Or why don't you sort of present some color on that?
Yeah, so I guess that when people think about like innovation in general, there are like four things that always come to mind. Manhattan Project, you name one, Apollo program, Park, Bell Labs, and a few others. It's always DARPA, perhaps. These are the usual examples. And people take this to mean that we have gotten worse at doing that. And there may be something to that, but also one also has to take into account that back in those days, you also had strong external pressures to the U.S. In this case, in the one case, the Second World War, the second case, the Cold War. So there was a very strong pressure to actually deliver these projects. So currently, there are, for example, if you take, for example, NASA. So NASA is currently working on the Constellation program. They're trying to go back to the moon, for example, and eventually to Mars. So, and then you have SpaceX, of course. SpaceX is working on their own, not a moonshot, but more of a Mars shot. NASA themselves, they have calculated that it would have been more expensive for them to develop what SpaceX is doing than NASA itself, which is kind of an indictment of NASA. And this is they themselves admitting so much. But then we have SpaceX seems to be moving very, very fast. So it doesn't seem to be something in like US culture or US society. It seems to be something either in the motivations or inner workings of the US government. If you look at also DARPA, for example, so DARPA has also done great work in this task of coordinating and bringing together various actors. And if you think of this like the golden age of DARPA, the things DARPA is famous for, usually the things that come to mind are kind of like from the 70s. Like maybe things that they are doing now, they will be more impressive in a few decades from now. But it seems that there is something going on in there. What that might be, as in why is the US government at large becoming so dysfunctional? As in, I don't have like a good big theory of that. One hypothesis is just like this idea of an external pressure from war in that case.
Yeah, and so is there any way we can get back to that without having a war?
Yeah, so I was interestingly, so if you go to the literature on the economics of innovation, the general consensus, although this is kind of evolving and it seems to be that war by itself is not that good for innovation in general. I mean, in the aggregate, because at the end of the day, the Manhattan Project, sure, we got nuclear power. You could argue perhaps that had we gone slower, we would have gotten there safer and without the stigma of nuclear weapons. So there is a case to be made against the Manhattan Program. Likewise, for the Apollo program, it's something I like to call the world's greatest and most amazing arts program, in that the practical outcomes in terms of like GDP growth, economic growth, were not that big, as in.
No.
And so it may well be that all those resources and coordination were not put towards kind of making innovation great. And so if you look at I guess like the ultimate metric, although somewhat flawed, if you look at GDP growth or total productivity growth through the Second World War, so the Second World War supposed like almost like a phase transition between the old and the new ecosystem of innovation in the US. So the US federal investments in R&D increased by a factor of 5. That was like huge. Previously, they were doing a few small things around. You had like NASA, and prior to that, you had NACA, like an airplane-oriented NASA institution, and some investment in agriculture. But it wasn't like the thing we know now with the NIH, the NSF, and all these big institutions. So they made all these investments, but that didn't show up, interestingly, in the statistics for innovation. So there is something strange there. And as I said, it may sound strange because, if anything, I've said that GDP more or less seems kind of going the same. But you could also argue, depending on how you cut the metrics, that it is slowing down, that we are getting less productivity and less innovation, which is a valid take. In which case, it's even more puzzling, right? We got like a 5x increase in R&D, and yet we are either getting the same. Like, no one is arguing that we are like progress is accelerating in general, at least. The one thing that may be the case is that it's something I do believe is that organizations in general, they usually don't survive for a long time in a healthy state. Organizations age, so to speak. So if you look at it may well be that the NIH or the NSF or current scientific institutions, when they were made, they were quite lean and efficient. But as they exist for a while longer, they maybe become more, in a way, sclerotic and slower and more bureaucratic. That there may be something to that. I mean, there's this funny thing I've heard that goes that a bureaucracy meets the needs of an expanding bureaucracy, in a way. As in, once you have this established structure, it will try to perpetuate itself and justify itself, even if it's not meeting its intended aims. So, for example, suppose, for the sake of the argument, that the Federal Reserve, in one case, that's not to go into particulars, suppose they find that actually we will be better off without a Federal Reserve for some reason. Do you think they're going to abolish themselves? That'll be extremely unlikely. Or for the matter of the NIH said, well, actually, maybe we should cut our funding in half and give this funding to someone else. That doesn't really, from a rational individual point of view, from the agents in the system, it doesn't really make sense. But it could be that that's the way to go. So, for example, I think that Patrick Collison suggested, and I think I agree with him on Twitter, that it may well be that a way to reinvigorate the NIH is to cut it in small chunks, to make it more diverse in a way, to make it instead of having the same. The NIH, to be sure, the NIH has or they have tried to have a rigorous peer-reviewed process. It's not like they try to make it bad. They have made great advances in trying to get grant peer reviews going faster, but still, I think there is room for improvement. Which again, so I guess one paper some people usually cite is this paper from Pierre Azoulay. It's a paper that compares the NIH with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, or the HHMI. So the NIH, the way it works, and by the way, if I focus on the NIH, it's because to some extent science funding is synonymous with the NIH. Like in the US, more than 50% of all science funding is the NIH, and maybe we can talk about why that is, but it's a good proxy. So you also have these smaller philanthropic institutions like the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. So what the NIH does is you apply for a grant, and then you get some money for the duration of the grant for a year, and you have to have both some results that support that your grant actually that what you're going to do actually makes sense, and then they're usually more or less. It cannot be too wild, but not too basic. It has to be in some nice sweet spot between moonshot and boring science. The HHMI, they basically select a few scientists and they fund them for a few years. They say, okay, here's your money, go do whatever, and you have freedom to pursue what you want. On the one hand, you could say, well, then they're going to get more lazy, or they are not subject to the discipline in a way of having to apply for grants and stuff. But on the other hand, they are free from the same constraint. At the same time, they can think on a more longer term. They can, instead of trying to publish the next paper, they can think 5 years ahead in a coherent research program. And so the paper I mentioned from Azoulay, he looked at the performance of scientists funded by both the NIH and the HHMI. And they found that the HHMI scientists, once you control for pre-existing skills and publications, those scientists, they tend to publish more impactful research. There is more variance, there's also some less, but you increase the variance. You get more of the breakthrough kind of stuff. And interestingly, the NIH recently published a paper a few years ago where they found the same thing. They found that the NIH has this program called the NIH Directors Award, which is similar to what the HHMI does, but it is not what the NIH does in general. And they found that scientists funded in this way by the NIH tend to also outperform their peers. So it seems that the idea that so-called funding people, not projects, I think that does seem to work, at least in the cases that have been tested. That giving that extra freedom to think in a more comprehensive long-term way, I think that is probably one of the most impactful things one can do to foster more and better science.
Yeah. And so say more about how sort of the science funding apparatus works. Why is the NIH 50%? Is there, and another sort of organizational question, is there a way in which you can design organizations such that they don't become super bureaucratic, that you could predict sort of the problems that will happen with them and sort of build for that internally? So I guess it's two sort of separate questions of how science funding works, how it should work, and then just organizational design.
Yeah, I think the first question, the way science funding works, I guess in a way, I think if you try to think it from first principles, how would you design a science funding system top down? You may imagine something you look at each field, look how promising it is, and then you allocate funding in some way like that, right? Some people may argue what if we should fund, let's say, archaeology or Sanskrit studies, because maybe those lines of research would lead to breakthroughs. And sometimes it happens. This paper that came from the field of Egyptology, looking at old Egyptian embalmed mummies, and it was usually in other areas of biology for sure. But I think everyone understands that some fields, both historically and also looking forward, they tend to deliver more of the kind of thing that most people, ultimately taxpayers who pay for the research, that most people want more of. Ultimately, you probably want to fund things that leads to, let's say, faster airplanes, better drugs, cures for cancer, better batteries, faster computers, things like that. And sure, there might be a role for generating knowledge for the sake of knowledge. It's an interesting problem to think about how do you square that with the whole apparatus, because probably the people that are thinking about this problem, about how to fund research, are people maybe that, in a way that, like me perhaps, that we share this passion for knowledge for the sake of knowledge. So maybe we may tend to be biased towards funding more of that. So in a way, you can look at mathematicians or like high energy physicists as generating interesting insights into the structures of mathematics and the universe. But you can also look at them and say, gosh, if these people were working on batteries or cures for cancer, would be making progress much faster. So that's the thing. So that's not the way it works. The way science funding actually works is that yes, that there is some attempt by different funding entities at doing this. So famously, the US, and this, in contrast to other countries, the US does not have a unified innovation strategy. There are different bodies and different entities that fund their own research and do their own research. And they each have their own criteria. So you have everything from I guess let's go to the NIH. So the NIH, if you go back to the 90s, the NIH was way smaller. And you had a bunch of people, including Bill Clinton back then, who said in the same way that physics propelled us all the way through the 20th century, and biology and life science is going to be the future in the 20th. It's going to be the engine of innovation. So we should fund that a lot. How much should that a lot be? So in the case of the NIH, you had lots of lobbying for more funding. You have both pharma. You also have associations of patients, cancer survivors, and people affected with cancer. It's a very, in a way, emotive issue. Like promising a war against cancer or the cure for cancer and illness, that's a really good sale, and it's difficult to oppose that. So if you go to Congress and you request for more money for that, it's easy to get. It's easier to get compared to other things. So if you go, for example, to material science, which is funded to some extent by the Department of Energy and the NSF, the National Science Foundation, in that case, you can say well, if you fund us, maybe we get faster airplanes and maybe better batteries and stuff like that. And it's it sounds nice, but it doesn't sound as vivid as a cancer cure. And so ultimately, it comes to a heavy dose of lobbying. Ultimately, you have both from the corporation point of view, and also from different groups that want the funding that lobby for that. So that's the current state of play, and I think that this is probably similar across countries to some or other extent. Maybe it's more egregious in some sectors, like maybe the aerospace and defense sector, where you have really old so-called prime contractors that have been there, like Lockheed Martin or Boeing, have been there forever, and they always get the interesting contracts. I mean, that has begun to change recently, but if you have an industry that has more or less been the same forever, and ultimately it kind of becomes a mesh with government officials, and you get these interesting dynamics. Now, I think that the difference between the things that are being currently funded is not super bad. I mean, it's not like the archaeologist lobby has captured all the R&D and we are only funding research missions to Egypt. I think that we are funding a lot of really things that I consider impactful and conducive to economic growth. But I think that more could be done to improve that situation.
Yeah. So, and you agree with sort of the Patrick Collison, Michael Nielsen, science is slowing down, or if you have any nuanced difference of opinion, where so?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't in this dinner with Patrick and other. I think I was asked this question. My answer was, that's the wrong question. You shouldn't ask that. I mean, if I had to answer this question, my answer is yes. But I think that that question by itself hides a lot of complexity, because if you answer yes, it sounds like, or it seems to presuppose it's a systemic factor that affects all of science, that is dragging it down, and then you will jump to try to find this one thing. But actually, I think that it's more. We should actually go on a case by case, sector by sector basis. So, for example, if you look at the life sciences, it's booming. You have all these advances day by day. You have all of these, every month there's a breakthrough paper, and not only there is an interesting paper, there are papers that overturns things that we thought were true. This is something we do not see in more settled fields. If you see, for example, I studied mechanical and aerospace engineering back at university. If you look at a textbook of classical mechanics from the 1880s, from Rankine, it's the same as we studied. Classical mechanics is more or less sorted. It's more of a filling the gaps and designing concrete applications. If you look at physics, for example, if you look at physics, people worry about physics, sure, we found that the Higgs boson was actually a thing. We confirmed that, but that was what we expected. The standard model predicted the Higgs boson. So far, there are some anomalies there in physics that we have not been able to explain. But so far, it seems that if you look at the recent years in physics, recent advancements, both from a theoretical merit point of view and also from the point of view of things you can apply, you don't really seem to see a lot of that recently. And it seems that more our knowledge of physics is extremely good. And actually, some people have even claimed, And I kind of subscribe to this view. Some people like Sean Carroll, a physicist, that physics for all intents and purposes, that is for useful applications, it's more or less complete. We will eventually perhaps get to a theory of everything that kind of unifies general relativity and quantum mechanics. But the levels of energy required to achieve effects or get effects that cannot be explained by current physics or that require this like new physics, they are so high that they are way, way into the future. I think that's probably the case. I mean, I wrote this article about is physics dead, basically, with a very, in a way, trying to see if people would come at me to tell me that I'm wrong, because I would really like to be wrong. But I think that it's mostly like the chances that we're going to discover, let's say things like faster than light travel, teleportation, like going back in time, Star Wars style anti-gravity spaceships. These things from science fiction, how likely is it that these things are actually possible? Not very likely. I mean, maybe we should always leave some small likelihood for these things, but currently it doesn't look like they are. However, if you look at things in biology, and again, chiefly you have like people are still dying of age, illness, and other things, and there is no physical limitation. There is no law of physics that says that you have to get ill, which means that there is still a very long like runway for biology. There is still plenty of things to learn, invent, and create in that space. So so the problems from physics are different from the ones in other fields. So in one case, it might be that one may see science like as an endless frontier, as something that it's kind of like you can always get more. Or maybe it's like the David Deutsch optimistic view. I think maybe he's still optimistic in there, but there's also the view that science is more like a plot of land, and you're like mining the plot of land. You are steadily getting more out of the mine, but it's finite eventually. You eventually run out of it. And maybe there's another plot of land, another, in a way, set of breakthroughs or paradigm, and you exploit the paradigm until the next one. But ultimately, the set of all those things, I also see it as bounded. So eventually, you run out of them. In some fields, run out of steam earlier than others. And so if a field, it seems like that's the cause, maybe you shouldn't really worry that much about improving the efficiency of science there in that field. But in other fields, if it seems like it's more or less, there are plenty of things to go, like again in life sciences, then in that case, you should worry more about exactly what is going on in there.
Yeah. And so just to get on the physics thing for a second, Eric Weinstein claims, and other people have claimed, to sort of like have been working on this theory of everything for a long time.
Yeah.
Do you follow that at all? Are you dubious of that happening? Is there a possible breakthrough there?
Yeah, I mean, so there are various proposals for so-called theory of everything in physics. And so historically, physics, you have like you had like different forces. You have like the weak electromagnetic force. You had like gravity, strong electromagnetic force, and then they have been steadily unified into like single theories. So currently we have this both we have kind of gravity around there. We have and also we have these two big families of theories, general relativity and quantum mechanics, that don't play well together. So people have proposed different theories for this. There is of course, maybe the most famous string theory, perhaps. Eric Weinstein has his own theory, also called topological. I don't know the name he was called. Yes, he has one theory. There is also Garrett Lisi. He's more of a heretic physicist that is he's more or less on his own. He's proposed a theory that apparently there is this mathematical group called a Lie group, like the E8 Lie group, and you can map a lot of current physics onto this object. And it's it's kind of a weird coincidence. So maybe this is telling us something, that there are particles that we haven't seen yet, and other forces and other interactions that we haven't seen, and so on. Okay, yes, there are these proposals indeed. The problems they tend to have, I think that there's this physicist called Sabine Hossenfelder. She has pointed out, one, that physicists sometimes tend to be misled by mathematical beauty, and the second, that many of these theories, at least in the medium, maybe in the long term, we can't test them. They require, for example, huge particle accelerators with huge energy scales to actually test. And if testing the theories, you need so much energy, actually getting to apply the theories, it might be also quite difficult. And so, so for example, if you take Eric Weinstein's theory or string theory, and you say, okay, if this theory is true, what does it enable? I think, can you do and the answer, I think it was also Weinstein's own answer, is that no. Or he tries to, in a way, probably deflect the question, although he sees the point of the theory for Weinstein, it's in part more to break the intellectual stagnation of physics. Because, that's an achievement on its own. It's to say, okay, you have been going around all these theories, and here is like a coherent, beautiful mathematical theory where everything fits and everything makes sense. And that's breaking what he sees as groupthink and stagnation. But if you ask him, okay, can we have a Star Trek now? I think the answer is no. Like, the theory doesn't predict things that we can readily use in that way. Now, there are some theories. There's this guy called Mike McCullough. He was funded by DARPA last year to pursue research in this called things he called quantized inertia. That he ultimately, apparently DARPA didn't like it and he lost funding. But in his case, he says, one, he has a theory that predicts that things like Star Trek or Star Wars style like anti-gravity ships are possible. That's one. Second, he proposes experiments that can be used to test this in the near term, which I think that, okay, fine. Maybe he's wrong. Maybe he's more of a crackpot. But I think that if your field is stagnating, you may as well give some money to the crackpots. Maybe they are right. And I think that if no one else is proposing things that are kind of would lead to breakthroughs and can be tested, importantly, then you may as well give these guys some money.
Yeah. So is sort of can you sort of, if you could wave a wand and change anything about how money is in sciences is allocated, what would you change? And then also separately, but somewhat related, over the next few years, potentially, one of your sort of side interests is exploring how science, how we can do it better. And so I'm curious what are the research questions you have or hope to solve.
Yes, as to, I guess, rather than, I think that more than an answer to the question, I have more or less an answer that generates a model that answers the question. I think because I think it's a complicated question. So the answer to the question looks like this much money will be allocated to this many fields. And I think to do that, you need to solve the problem of predicting how successful these fields are going to be, which is not easy. I think that probably, some changes I will probably take funding out of high energy physics and fields that, at least on my view, or also from some higher mathematics, and I will probably put that funding towards more, again, biology. I think that biology, if you go by the heuristic that the present rate of progress in a discipline is suggestive of its potential and impact, I think that definitely you can maybe, if you manage to find a way of measuring rates of progress in different disciplines towards useful applications, you can probably find like some kind of a weighted average that say, okay, this field is making so much progress, so you get a larger proportion of all the funding. And sure, you still want to fund these things that don't really seem to go anywhere because maybe they go somewhere. But you should, I think, compared to the current status quo, we should definitely be more biased towards towards life sciences. This is not just because of the money, because as I mentioned, so if you look at how much money physics gets, it's not like it's a lot, right? If you're doing theoretical physics, you are like sitting on an armchair thinking about the world. It's that the talent. Ultimately, the reason people choose one career or another, it's partly because there are opportunities in those fields. And so if you put more money in biology, you may get some people who would have otherwise gone into, let's say, doing maths, into maybe they will be doing computational biology, but you will put them in this field. I think that the biggest constraint to innovation, I think, is not so much money. It's probably just having people having ideas. That's probably the single biggest bottleneck for innovation. I think if you go to the economics of innovation, actually, you look at all these models of economic growth, that the usual key driver is usually either population growth. It's like having more people, having more ideas, plus then some adjustments for if you have more knowledge, maybe you get knowledge acquisition gets faster because you have already a broader knowledge base, or maybe gets slower because you have already kind of mined all this knowledge. But that's the key thing. You need to allocate your brain power carefully. And I guess also another very impactful policy here is immigration. So you probably want to let people suppose there's like a genius researcher in Nigeria, and that would be better funded and networked if they go to let's say like UCLA or whatever. But because of visa issues, it's not going to be easy for them, and the whole world will be missing out on their talent. So you want to easily allow high skilled people to do this. Now, for professors and researchers to some extent, this is a reality. This is more of a reality than for people. So the US visa system is kind of draconian and contrived. but it is somewhat easier for researchers. But you still want to make it super easy. For example, in the European Union, if you're born in Spain, you can just walk into Germany and get a job there. You don't have to get a visa or sign anything. It is as if you go to a city in your same country. And that's, I think, a dream, a very legitimate dream to aspire to. The dream where if you have a good idea, you can just go and build it or research it wherever you are.
Totally. And so talk more about innovation, how it really works, what misconceptions we have about it, when we don't have it, why not, and how we should be getting more of it.
Yeah, I think so. For innovation, there are, as I said, so the raw material is people having ideas. Well, not people having ideas, it's people noticing that something is broken or something, or knowledge is satisfactory. Step one, step two, fixing it. It sounds like, duh, of course. But historically, people were not like that. I think not everyone had this mentality. You just accepted things were like they are. And there is a historian, Anton Haus, who has written this book or published these papers about the so-called mentality of innovation and how it might have helped cause the industrial revolution in the UK. So that's one big component of that. But okay, but if you have ideas and you don't have anything else, that's very nice, but doesn't go anywhere. So you also need funding, of course. So historically, most of the innovation we have had, they were either as people just innovating both in private companies. Then you have like either kings or princes having like paying for example, you had like the Medicis paying for researchers and they staying and like in-house researchers like Galileo. But then as we get closer to now, then you have like a stronger role for government. So there is this idea that research in general, there is this public goods problem that research. If you invest in research, you're not going to capture all the benefits from that. Eventually, people will copy you, and people will be inspired by your research, and they will do other things. So, because you're not going to capture all of that. So, for example, there's this guy, John Goodenough. He was not single-handedly, but he basically invented the modern like batteries that we use. Like, he's not like a multimillionaire or anything. But it's like he had a huge impact, and yet he didn't get all that money. So there's this argument that you also need some public investment in there. You need some like extra thing from the government. Now, I think that you can make like a weak and a strong version of this argument. The strong version is that some discoveries will not happen if you don't support them from the state. I do not believe this is true. I think that usually like big science projects that are very difficult to fund, extremely large projects, extremely expensive, are again Manhattan Project, Apollo program, large telescopes. Those are usually not the ones that lead to let's say cures for cancer. There are some exceptions of big science, like for example the large, the Human Genome Project. But usually science can be done on a small project basis. So if you, I guess like the public funding, what we'll do is to accelerate or decelerate the rate of innovation. In some cases, it could decelerate it because of this phenomenon. Like if you find, for example, again, Second World War, you had all this money put into like defense R&D. You had all these people researching that stuff. Well, there was this paper that measured productivity in other sectors, and productivity fell during the Second World War because these people were not doing research on how to, let's say, get better like cars, batteries, or airplanes. And so it can be that funding sectors that do not directly contribute to economic growth slows down economic growth. So that's funding. Okay, but besides that, it's not just people on their own or even labs doing research. The right way to think about this is in systems of innovation. It's in ecosystems of different kinds of entities. So you have both like large public institutes like the NIH. You also have private foundations. You have private labs. In the past, you used to have like so-called gentleman scientists like Darwin, or more recently Alfred Loomis in the Second World War. These are people that on their own, they do research, they publish papers, and they do experiments, and they contribute to scientific knowledge. So you have all these entities. You also have entities that help with cooperation. But some of them are public, like DARPA is the most famous one. So these entities help notice gaps in both in knowledge and also in application of that knowledge. But they also have public-private partnerships between companies. One, for example, is Sematech. So Sematech is a consortium made by semiconductor manufacturers in the US. Sematech initially was half public, half private funded. Nowadays, I think it's just privately funded. But the idea was to kind of, it's like, you have like Intel and you have like other semiconductor manufacturers. And a lot of the research is going to be kind of the same. why duplicate research? Why not do research together and then share that? So companies sometimes will do this on their own. They will create this called research consortia to do this. And again, this can also be facilitated or made difficult by policy. So for example, also if you go back to I think it was the 60s or 70s, because of antitrust regulations, companies were like, oh, we're not going to collaborate with our companies because they might raise like antitrust against us. When they actually made clear that association with the purpose of R&D was fine under the antitrust laws, then you saw a huge increase in the number of how much companies were collaborating together, showing that the right kind of policy really matters.
Let's get into sort of how innovation shows up in the statistics. So maybe you could talk about sort of what GDP does well, what it doesn't do well, how we measure innovation, and how you think we can improve that.
Yeah. So I guess if you ask someone like on the street, what is innovation? What comes to mind intuitively about the concept of innovation is things like new discoveries, maybe some people make distinction between innovation and invention, but usually more knowledge, or even just more like better things in general, like more discoveries, more useful applications of knowledge. Okay, so this is what people have in mind for innovation. Okay, so but when economists talk about innovation, what they usually measure is something called total factor productivity, or TFP. The way this is measured, it kind of sounds very like it doesn't sound like something very rigorous, but you literally take GDP and you say that GDP equals some constant times the amount of labor times the amount of capital, like GDP equals capital times labor times productivity, and then you measure how much this constant changes over time. And that's it basically. It's like you're aggregating together like all different kinds of labor and all different kinds of capital, and then you're measuring this thing. That's what productivity is. I mean, it's an issue to measure metric. It correlates with things you may care about, but it doesn't sound very intuitive, right? Like, it doesn't sound like it should obviously correlate with what you think. For example, suppose that the rate of scientific discovery or the rate of improvement in science is constant. But suppose that you have like awful housing regulations, then you're going to see a decrease in TFP, even though scientific progress is still going perfectly fine. So you have to be careful about what that means. So again, just to finish up with this, so another ways people have of measuring innovation is looking at things like patents, paper citations. Recently, there's this recent work on trying to use, I think, more of a machine learning approach, looking at the way like patents and papers and the way they are cited to see exactly what is being impactful or even what the news talk about. Try to relate people getting really excited in the news about something to papers. Ultimately, there are all these different ways that people go out doing it. As for GDP, so GDP. Ultimately matters because you cannot eat innovation. Like ultimately, you have to produce things that will then lead to welfare, and that is the idea that gets captured in GDP. So GDP, if you look at most things that are in a way good, not all of them, but if you look at things like lifespan or like crime or various other things, they usually correlate with, also how many hours on average people work, things like that. They usually correlate with GDP. So it seems that GDP, it's a measure of how much can we produce, and more so if you look at GDP per capita, because some countries may just be very big, so they will have large GDP, but you probably want to compare out per capita, how much wealth you have per person. So as I said, this is a good enough metric, and actually Tyler Cowen says that it's probably good enough for most intents and purposes. And yet, you may argue, for example, that some things that seem very important do not show up in GDP. So, for example, like this tech company, people like to complain about tech companies. Tech companies are great. Like we are exploiting them all the time. They give us like free, like Android, a free operating system, Gmail, like all of these things for free. And people have we should quantify how much enjoyment people get from these things. When you do that, you get changes to the official GDP statistics, but they're not huge adjustments. They don't change like the overall trends. Another adjustment you can make to GDP is that GDP measures basically how much we are selling and buying from each other in a way, but these things also change over time. Like if a television costs, let's say, like $500 today, and the same amount 10 years ago. It's not the same television. Now it has more features. So you have to account for that. And how do you do that? Well, there's its own literature on doing that, which again can lead to, I think Eric Weinstein has complained that these adjustments can be used for political ends, try to bias or hide the actual trends that are reflective of growth. You can also look at not at GDP per capita, but maybe some people look at GDP per household. There's this very famous picture that shows like productivity growth more or less going up, and GDP per capita or per household more or less going flat after 1970. That happens, I think it's more or less fake news, and it happens because one, it's not accounting for the fact that households are smaller now. Like, you have more single people. If you have like two incomes, then of course your household has more money. Second, benefits. It's not just you get your salary, you also get other benefits on top of that. And also you have inflation, and you have to account for inflation properly. So once you do all these adjustments, you find that at least in the US, so GDP per capita has been increasing, even for all the quantiles, for all the quantiles of income. So it's not. I mean, sure, it's not like going maybe as fast as it used to, but it's not flat and stagnating. So Tyler Cowen also says, okay, there are other things that we should care about. If you want to like maximize one thing, Tyler also proposes to add to what he calls GDP or wealth class. We should also count how many hours of leisure we have, how much spare time we have. We should also count things such as like health or things like the environment. I think maybe if we are degrading the environment, maybe GDP is growing very fast, but maybe that means that in the future it's going to collapse because we are depleting our resources. So I think that all those things should be really there. But I think that suppose that someone tries to come up with a metric that it's radically different from GDP. It tries to get at welfare, but it at the same time is not very correlated with GDP. I think that probably that metric will not easily correlate with our intuitions about what progress and good things are. People have tried. So instead of looking at money, you can look at other things. You can look at things like civil liberties. You can look at things like also like gender equality across countries. There are a few indices for that. You can also try to also again account in these ways for what the things that Tyler mentioned. And when you no matter how you slice the data, you end up with more or less the same rankings. Like all these things usually correlate like more like 60% with each other. And just to finish off with this, I think that it is important to not just look at GDP or just like raw metrics and just believe them, because all these numbers, the data they come from can have mistakes. Again, this is an article I wrote, I think like 5 years ago about the GDP of Cuba. So Cuba seems to have a very high. So Cuba doesn't seem like a country that's like super developed, but it seems to have a very high human development index and GDP for that matter, which sounds very strange. It doesn't intuitively correlate with what you expect like a highly central planned socialist regime to have. But actually, if you dig into the data, if you go to a World Bank and to the appendices of how the data was made, you find that actually the data people usually give was actually not correct. They were using like the wrong like GDP deflator. So they were converting Cuban pesos, their own GDP, to dollars in the wrong way, and also they were. And also there were other things like they were measuring, in that case, abortions in a completely different way. If you want to look at abortion rates and other things, so if you see a number out there, you have to see, okay, where this number came from. Should I trust this number? So you should look at different metrics and see if everything is points in the same direction of progress. And if it doesn't, then take the one trend or the trends that do not go are progressing and figure out why.
And do you think that do you agree with sort of Peter Thiel's sort of cultural critique of sort of not just Silicon Valley, but just the West generally, in the sense that we're just way less ambitious than we used to be?
I think that to give credit to Peter, I think that maybe 5 years ago I will be less inclined to believe that. Now I think he's probably right that there is some to that. I don't think it is the only thing, or I'm not even sure it's the main thing, but I think there's definitely something to that. So one reason people have given for this, as in, is it just culture? Can we just restart culture? So maybe one reason people give is that maybe our culture is we're getting older in a way, and maybe once you get older, more settled, maybe you have more to lose, you get more risk averse. There may be something to that. So you can look at, is it just the US, or is it a general pattern across all the countries? Is it that is anyone maintaining this culture of innovation? So people say, okay, China. So China seems to be kind of like people seem very, and one reason the Chinese Communist Party seems to enjoy to support is because it's delivering lots of progress and innovation. People are optimistic of their future. People can look at their parents or their grandparents that were like on the rice farms in a very poor country, and now see themselves like look at what progress can do. Progress can take you from poverty to this. What can more progress do in a one more generation? We should keep working on that. While in the US, it's more like maybe people are thinking we're doing all this work for what? We're running faster, but we're not getting anywhere. People may be thinking that. If we want to get, I mean, as I said, there's probably something to it. I am not going to reject that hypothesis, but if you want to get into quantifying how much of the effect is due to that, that's where it gets difficult, because there is no. I think I haven't seen anyone trying to come up with a good metric or like a cultural health index of some kind, or entrepreneurial culture index that you can apply to say, okay, culture got worse and it's causally affecting these metrics in this way, and moreover, we can change culture in such and such way. So, for example, people have said, okay, we should, for example, write more optimistic science fiction, more things to get people excited about the future. That may be true. I mean, intuitively, it seems that it should do something. So maybe so with Peter Thiel, I think he likes to think in terms of like broad worldview, high-level trends of society. And that I think enables him to see things that maybe are not obvious to everyone else. Everyone else will be like, oh, this is like, who cares about that? This is probably not true. But also I think that he also tends to just like take one example and then just like take it, generalize the example to like, oh, everything is slowing down from a few examples. In a cultural case, I think he's maybe more or less right. Although with a more constructive mindset, so he has rightly pointed this out. And to his credit, he's not just complaining. He's actively funding both through he has like various funds and especially through his lab funding basic science, breakout labs. He's actually trying to reignite the engine of growth and progress. But culturally, how do you restart a culture? How do you make a culture optimistic again? That is something that I don't really have a good answer for. I think that's something really hard.
We're talking about how to change culture. Progress studies sort of came on the scene last year. Talk about what you think about it, what your hopes are, where you agree or disagree, and where it could potentially fit into either academia or just culture at large.
Yeah, so Patrick Collison and Tyler Cowen, they came up with this idea of progress studies. Interestingly, so some people have a very negative reaction. They thought like, oh, we're already doing that, or obviously like you are reinventing the wheel. Other people, including myself, we're really excited about that. So progress studies, the way I interpret it, is to try to be kind of like doctors of progress, to try to look at progress in a more holistic way and see exactly what is broken and how we can fix it. And so it sounds like an obvious basic idea that surely people are doing already, and people are doing it. People are doing things like this already, but they are calling for two things. One, more of it. They're calling for more people looking more into the history of progress, what got us here, and should we go back to that? Should we change anything? And looking at the present, what things are we doing wrong that are not great for progress? And then second, to try to get people to kind of like from different disciplines to talk together. So for example, if you want to understand Silicon Valley as an entity, it's like famously, like Silicon Valley is a state of mind. Like you can visit San Francisco and eat avocado toast, but you wouldn't really know or experience what it is to be in San Francisco if you don't talk to the people there about like startups and stuff. So in that case, you will probably need at least some sociology, maybe some anthropology, history, economics, of course. Maybe you also need some object level knowledge about disciplines. If you want to understand progress in biology, you need to know some biology. So you need like this very multidisciplinary profile to look at these things. Now, I think that, so currently progress studies, there are a few people. I think I see myself kind of like part of this nascent tradition. You also have David Crawford. He has this blog, The Roots of Progress. It has been like looking at the development of various technologies and also running this seminar to try to it's like a progress studies seminar for high schoolers to try to get them interested in progress and progress studies. I think that's also a great idea. I think ultimately, if we go back to this idea of innovation comes from people noticing what's broken and fixing it. You need to foster that. You need to tell people, look, all these things you have around you, don't take them for granted. You didn't always have them. I think I wrote in my blog this thing that you don't demand or you don't want the future until the future is here. Sometimes, like no one wanted iPhones until they saw the iPhone. It's like, oh, obviously, and now who lives without smartphones? It's like, but back then it's like, it sounds, with innovation, it sounds like we very easily get used to what we have around us. And this is not just maybe as a society level. If you look at, say, at institutions, at companies, if you look at a startup, for example, if you look at a startup, which I guess also falls on the progress side, because good management also leads to progress. It sounds like things like good management practices, management books, McKinsey. It sounds like may sound like it's empty, vague advice, but actually no. Actually, there are randomized controlled trials of teaching good management practices to companies, and it works. So also these things should also be examined under progress studies. So if you look at the startups, initially they go very fast. Like everything moves too fast. They are iterating on the product very quickly, delivering, shipping every week. As they grow, things tend to slow down. People become more like, this tool, like, it's slower now. It used to be faster, but like it's not like going to be fired for this. Maybe you lose some of the initial passion from the founders, and you're replaced with people that just want to do their job in the entity, and then again, like you join this entity, you didn't see how fast things were in the past in the startup or in society, and so you don't demand these things to be faster. You get used to mediocrity. So I think it is very important both to, in a way, to look back, to be able to look forward. And I think that this is an approach, an angle that I think it's underexplored, and that the progress studies really will help with.
Talk about the broader state of research in academia, and what are the challenges, what can do better? You talked earlier about sort of the challenges and opportunities for funding, but how about just like the way the research organizations are structured themselves, and what could be changed about academia? You can wave one.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, so the way academia works, well, there are of course various ways in which it works, but usually most countries have either some kind of funding entity that you have to apply for grants to get money from this entity to be able to do research, and you have some positions that are kind of fully funded. You kind of do whatever you want with these grants. By and far, the first model is the most common. So you may think, well, okay. If you look at if you try to get deep down to the details of how this works, you find that actually scientists are spending a lot of time applying for grants. According to some papers, to some people that have looked into this, 50% of their time is actually applying for grants. They may argue that maybe applying for a grant in a way is doing research because you have to be reading papers and writing. It may well be, but half of your time applying for grants sounds like a lot. So some people have tried to quantify how much money is in a way lost in this process, because it's not just that they apply for the grants, it's only that people are also reviewing their grants. So in Australia, I think their national science funding agency found that 10% of all the money they give is consumed by, if you put like people's time in their salaries, it's consumed by this process. Now, this may be a good thing. You may argue that, well, they are spending this time to actually make sure that the best science is being funded. But actually, if you look at the literature on how effective it is, it's not that great. Like some papers, sometimes like you submit a paper to 3 journals or 4, and 2 of them will reject you, 1 will accept you. Even even very famous, impactful papers, they get denied on their first submission. So suppose that you want to improve the situation. Okay, so first you have to take into account that most science is not done by professors or principal investigators or PIs. Most science is done by PhD students, postdocs, and people like that, and research assistants. And so not everyone in science or in a lab is applying for grants. So even if you manage to have like a system where it doesn't take any time to apply for grants, even then you are not going to get 50% like a huge boost to how many hours are put into science. Again, this is not like, it's not like it should not be done. It's just that we have to think about what are the more impactful areas. So this is one area, grant funding. I think one interesting recent experiment with this is the FAST Grants program from Tyler Cowen. He's funding research for COVID and doing it very, very fast. As in, literally, they get an application and they reply in like 1 or 2 days. And the applications are also very short. And the research they're funding, it seems to be also quite impactful. It appears in the news. It's also it seems to be judged by researchers as very interesting. So it seems that you can actually be faster without losing quality, which means that even if it's not a huge improvement, it is an improvement and it should be pursued. But beyond that, what are more impactful things in which that we can do to make science better? So as I said, one way is to actually allocate funding in a different way. That's just on the funding side. So assuming, let's say that you're a funding agency, your funding is fixed, but you're going to spend the money more or less is fixed. What can you do on top of that? So some people say, okay, maybe you can some of your funding give it in the form of lotteries. This is something people have suggested because it may be that some papers may be too risky, too moonshotty, so to speak, and they don't get funded. And so with lotteries, you actually can, like anyone could apply potentially and they get some money, and maybe it's wasted, but maybe you also get some of this weird research funded. So funnily enough, if you look at organizations that claim to fund risky research, like there is this program from the European Union, this is like they fund risky research, and it's like, okay, what's your rate of failure? It's not very high, which means that it's probably not risky to begin with. So that's one. You probably want to either do more lotteries or have fewer veto points that people can say no to some given research avenue. As I said earlier, you also probably want to maybe fund less projects but for longer, so that people don't feel as much pressure to just like slice their work into smaller chunks and actually think in a more comprehensive way. But there is more. So for example, Laura Deming, so she started the Longevity Fund because she thought that there's a lot of research going on that is not being translated into useful applications. And so she wanted to help translate this stuff into startups and ultimately into the clinic and pass FDA approval. And you can go also one step further in the pipeline. You can ask, okay, is there anything we can do to actually get scientists to actually produce ideas better, to actually lubricate the gears of science itself? And yes, so I guess I was mentioning the example of DARPA earlier. So DARPA, we were talking about earlier about organizations like and how as they age, they tend to maybe become less dysfunctional. DARPA, to the contrary, DARPA is constantly rotating their program managers. DARPA stays in a way young by replacing itself very quickly. And what DARPA does is people like to say that DARPA kind of invented the internet or something like that. No, DARPA fostered collaboration that led to ARPANET, which was the origin of the internet. That's what DARPA does. DARPA doesn't do research of its own. DARPA pulls together and coordinates various actors. They were maybe pursuing the different lines of research on their own. And they say, hey, this thing you are doing here, in industry and in academia and elsewhere, you should work together on the same program to deliver one easily measurable deliverable. So this is the thing. Basic science, it's difficult to measure if it's going to be impactful. Like no one knows if one given paper is going to be a breakthrough in 20 years. As you get closer to applications, it becomes more obvious if where it's going. And so the DARPA way of doing this is to actually sit in between this basic science stuff and this more applied stuff, and actually say, okay, we're going to make an effort to take these things, which are more, it seems like it's possible to take the state of the art in one field or various fields, and make a program to deliver an easily measurable, tangible, and concrete deliverable. For example, it can be like better self-driving cars or a cure for one particular aspect of aging. Okay, so then they are able to do this because they, like, as scientists, if you're in a lab researching, let's say, telomeres, one of the things that they shorten with aging. If you're in a lab studying telomeres, maybe you don't care about the immune system because you're not going to publish in that field. So you're not even reading the papers. Like if you want to be successful as a scientist, you have to focus on what you are doing. Sure, some people are more lucky in that they have maybe more funding, their lab is bigger and they can pursue more topics. But usually scientists are not trying to coordinate their fields as such. So this is something that we are missing. So Adam Marlstone, so he's currently working at DeepMind, but he did his PhD with two very famous scientists, Ed Boyden and George Church. So he has this idea of what he calls the focused research organizations. And you can think of them as kind of very smaller, maybe like $20 to $100 million, smaller Manhattan projects in a way. The idea of these things would be to actually take research that, again, it's either maybe researchers, you read the papers and say sometimes, oh, we couldn't do this because we didn't have money. Or you see, hey, this thing here and this thing in this other field, they seem like if these people talk together or collaborated in this way, would get somewhere really interesting. Or this field is slow because they don't have this specific tool. So we should get them this tool. And so the purpose of these organizations would be to say, okay, our aim is not going to be to publish papers or like get tenure or anything. Our aim is to actually hire a bunch of researchers. We're going to solve this problem. Our deliverables, we will define some metrics and some things we have to deliver, and we will actually deliver a tangible thing. This thing may be a tool, it may be a drag, it may be somewhere along the spectrum between basic and applied. But that's the key thing. It's something that tries to push things more towards being applied. And I think that this is potentially quite powerful. I think there are not many organizations really doing this. And the idea that Adam had is that with this organization, with this focused research organization, is that potentially even a philanthropist could fund one of these ones. It shouldn't have to go through like the political process to get budget for that. And so in principle, it seems that everyone who has studied like the DARPA model, which in a way is kind of model after DARPA, everyone seems to think that this is a good way of fostering innovation. You foster cooperation. Research is not necessarily done in-house. You can leverage different labs. You avoid sclerosis by rotating your program managers quickly. So maybe the organization it's like we're going to do research for 5 years, and then we close down. We just disappear, and then we set a new one for something else to make sure things are kept in a useful state at an organizational level.
Yeah, and going back to the sort of organizational design question, how do you, if you're creating new NIH, new NSF, new sort of DARPA, how do you sort of build in for the fact that these will get sclerotic or bureaucratic over time? Sort of ahead of Samo Bergia talks a lot about succession problem. How do you sort of and that's sort of just one version of the problem of organizational sort of entropy. How do you build for that in advance?
That's a good question. So Samo, as you said, I think he had this thing about like there has never been a society that did forever, or why. Or like Patrick Collison also had this question: How do we design? Maybe the opposite. How do we design organizations, or how do you think of organizations that don't naturally die? At first, it may be tempting to say that it's an intrinsic problem that it's difficult to avoid. Like if you look at, for example, if you look at states, for example, it seems like they, like all of them or many of them, especially the bigger ones, they tend to just get bogged down in bureaucracy, and it's difficult to roll it back and make them kind of more lean again. So maybe one thing you could do is to try to borrow a page from DARPA actually. So there is this literature on the sociology of organizations. I think when you're a manager, how do you see yourself in the organization? How do you think about meetings? How do you think about systems? Are you maybe unconsciously doing things that make you look good in the organization, but actually maybe are not good for the organization? So DARPA tries to break, in a way, I guess maybe the broad term is corporate politics. That maybe corporate politics is what you want to avoid. You want everyone aligned with the mission of the organization and not so kind of their own self benefit. So as I said, DARPA manages to do this by lots of rotation. Elon Musk, like the Elon Musk companies, like Tesla or SpaceX, from what I've heard from people that work there, compared to other places, it's easier to get fired in there. And if you're not performing, so teams have a lot of. But if you're a manager, you have a lot of power to do more or less what you want within your realm. But if you're not performing, you're just kicked out. Like it doesn't matter if you're a senior engineer with 10 years of experience. If you don't deliver, you're out. And maybe you can replicate some of this. I mean, also again, if you look at the psychology of managers, like people don't like firing employees. Like on an emotional level, they don't like that. If you're a manager, you may try to protect your direct reports against being fired, which again, it's understandable, right? It's like you see them every day. They are kind of your colleagues. You don't want them to be fired, but maybe the organization needs them to be fired on a kind of. It's maybe like a prisoner's dilemma. Maybe it's good for your team, but it's bad for the organization as a whole. So maybe something you could do is the following. There is this idea that this comes from the idea of quality engineering, the ISO 9001 standard. And this idea is that you should make every role in your company extremely legible, so legible that if you fire someone tomorrow, you can bring someone in, and the next day they can start doing the job. Like everything is so clearly defined that everyone fits in what they are doing, and you can actually easily replace people easily. You don't have like vague institutional dark matter knowledge that is there, like implicit knowledge in the organization that makes it difficult to rejuvenate or replace people. Once you have that kind of organization that is very much plug and play, then you can actually do that. You can say, okay, we are hiring you for 1 year. Like you don't hire an employee indefinitely, you hire for 1 year. And after 1 year, regardless of how they were doing, their contract ends and you hire someone else. And that would maybe that's this way you could avoid some of the politics. The risk here is that you may lose some of this institutional knowledge of what happened or was tried before, that you don't want to repeat the same mistakes in the future. DARPA tries to fix this by both keeping records of what they did, and then second, because current program managers, they can all just talk to previous ones and they can see actually what worked or what didn't work. So maybe this would be the one thing. So next time you start a startup, that you can be like, okay, you're hiring you for 1 year. Now, if you're applying for this job, I mean, from the point of view of getting like an indefinite contract, like until you're fired versus you're in for 1 year, it feels less stable. Like it doesn't feel like, I mean, it feels worse for the employee. Like why would you choose this 1 year contract? If the organization, maybe it's very innovative, very interesting to work for, maybe you are going to choose it. Or maybe if it's not 1 year, maybe it's like more like 5 or 3. But that's it. I think that ultimately it might be more systemic than we think. I mean, it's both the way the organization gets designed plugs into the way that which people are going to recruit and who's going to willing to work for you, what kind of corporate environment you're going to generate. And so you may have this paradox that the environment that works for the long term is not the environment that works for the short term, like acquisition of talent. So you end up with this paradox that there is no escape, perhaps, except if you are in a specific situations, again, like in the DARPA case. If you are a particular kind of organization, maybe in that case you can pull it off at that age, and that's it. And then in general you have the strongest force containing institutional degeneration is the market. Like you can fool politicians into funding you as much as you may be able to, but you cannot fool the market for that long. Well, maybe if you're Theranos, maybe you can keep it going for a while, but eventually the actual people catch up. So companies have this. So this is a way that systemically you solve this problem by having market discipline. So if your company isn't performing, it gets replaced. Okay. So again, in a way, this pushes the problems either to monopolies or large government entities, like the NIH or even the FDA. So for example, again, taking the FDA, we're talking earlier about the governments getting slower, sclerotic, and less innovative. So suppose someone proposes to break the NIH, to break the FDA in half, like to have 2 FDAs. Both FDAs can approve drugs. They have their own separate procedures and they can do their own thing. Now, this sounds kind of recipe for chaos, but the European Union does this not for drugs, but they do this for various things. So you have like loads of regulatory agencies, all of which can certify that your product actually complies with the standards. So you can go to any of these regulators. So if you're Spanish, you can go to the Spanish one or the German one or the English one, and any of them, and you can actually shop around to see which one actually has more know-how about your particular innovation, so they actually get it through. And then if for some reason your innovation product actually gets through, and you didn't meet the standards, actually, so for example, suppose you have a medical device or an elevator that actually falls down, actually it's broken, then states will be periodically sampling the market for those products and testing that actually they actually do what they say they do. And if they don't, they force companies to pay a huge fine and recall everything they sold and recall it back, which is a strong incentive to comply. So you get both like less upfront costs to actually getting things through, and you also get this surveillance element coupled with it. I think that this is, again, maybe this is something that shouldn't be straightforwardly applied to drug approvals, but maybe if you have 2 FDAs and you have like a meta FDA of sorts that imposes which criteria you should apply for drugs. So maybe if you open your own quote FDA and you have lower standards, then maybe you can approve drugs, but only for maybe your drugs, you have to like clearly label them. Maybe it's only for one specific set of people. Maybe it's only maybe you allow like, let's say, people that are like terminal patients to try them, while the other FDA would not. So in that way, you are in a way going from one veto point to many parallel veto points, and any one of which could let one innovation through. So that's I guess also another recipe. But yes, I think the general case of this problem, like what's the right way to think about this kind of long-lived institutions, both private and public, I think it hasn't been fully solved yet. I think we have some heuristics and some examples of things that may work. Now the challenge is to see exactly when these patterns can be applied and when they may lead to failure.
Yeah. Where do you disagree at all with sort of Balaji Srinivasan's thoughts on the FDA? I'm not sure if you followed his or just Jim O'Neill or other sort of people in sort of the Peter Thiel ecosystem who sort of have strong views about the FDA.
Yeah, so I guess that angle of the FDA is that the FDA is too conservative, that the FDA is like saying no to too many things. That may be true. I mean, but so one argument given for that is that the number of drugs approved per amount of funding going into R&D for drugs was going down. So the so-called Eroom's law, like Moore's law in reverse. But that, funnily enough, doesn't seem to be true. For the last 5 years. That's not true anymore. It seems to be flat. As in, it's not getting worse. It's kind of stable, and the absolute number of drugs being approved is going up. So it's not that bad. Now there are some papers indeed. So if you look at some papers in the economics literature showing that indeed the FDA is being conservative not only in the kind of things they approve, but also on how much time they take to approve things. And again, the FDA has improved, I think, by a factor of 5 how fast they approve things since I think was it the 60s or 70s. So they're improving it. It's not that everything is bad. But there's something to that. So I guess there is. The reason the FDA was founded was this people were scared about thalidomide, this drug that when pregnant women they take with their kids will born with various deformities, and it's like, oh, never again we're going to stop this. The thing is that there is a cost to safety ultimately. Ultimately, you are paying some cost for that, and so if you do a cost-benefit analysis of the FDA, according to which papers, you find that actually you want to let more drugs through, even though you may actually, they may have side effects. People will die as a result. So you have to live with that. So if you're willing to actually say, okay, what we care about is it's the expected increase in the total number of like disability adjusted or quality adjusted life years. If you do that, in some models, you should actually let more drugs through. However, I think that, there is something to this view. There is also the opposite view, that the FDA is letting through too many things, specifically too many things in the area of cancer drugs. And again, if you look at these papers in this literature, about, okay, so this drug costs this much. So some of the newest one may cost like hundreds of the treatment can cost like hundreds of millions of dollars. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you look at these treatments, how much do they work? They seem to work, but the effects are so small. Maybe they add 1 or 2 extra months of life. That if you think of this like if you're going to put a price tag of an extra life, of an extra year of healthy life, they are not worth it. So if you don't approve these drugs, on the aggregate, the economy would be better off. Now the question is, what determines the price of drugs? It's another funny one. Is that suppose that you are like a pharma company, you just develop a new drug and you want to put the price on that. What do you put in there? So in most other places, you put the price, whatever price that more or less the market will more or less people will buy, but it's not low enough that they're not going to make money. So in that case, there's some case to be made that companies has priced their drugs as high as they humanly can, as high as they can without getting blowback from all bad press. Because from some drugs, Medicare. So once a drug gets FDA approved, Medicare has to pay the cost of the drug, no matter how much it costs, which is kind of like a bit of a bad incentive. Like you are incentivizing that you develop this like marginally improved drug that doesn't really help much, but you're then throwing all this money behind that. And sure, I mean, it may be different if patients are paying for their own drugs. It may be different, but to some extent, and also if you count for like both Medicare and Medicaid, it's not quite like that in the US. if you go to the UK, for example, the UK has this organization called NICE, National Institute for Care Standards or something, I think. Well, what they do is exactly that. They assess therapists to see how effective are they and how cost effective are they. So NICE will say, okay, you are 70 years old, like your life expectancy is only like a few extra years. We are not going to pay. The public healthcare is not going to pay for your treatment because you are not worth it. And likewise, they will say, okay, this for example thing, these newer treatments with CAR T antibodies, chimeric antigen receptor. So these ones are extremely expensive, maybe even $1 million the whole treatment. So these ones, they will only pay for them if you are like 25 or younger. If not, well, good luck, I guess. That's their approach. It's a more like a more draconian approach to cost control. But I think if you have a public health system, you have to have something like this. And the US is, in a way, trying to have its cake and eat it too. It's trying to give the best. But again, to its credit, people like to criticize the US healthcare. The US healthcare system, if you can afford it, is the best in the world. Like if you have cancer, you will live longer if you're in the US than elsewhere. But there is a cost to that, and maybe that cost may not be that much worth it. Secondly, it may incentivize that companies they may be focusing on things that are just incremental improvements, just because they can get through FDA approval and actually deliver a small improvement. They can do this, one, because they know they can charge these high prices, and second, because the way drugs get evaluated, they don't do like a randomized trial with people and they don't like randomly put cancer in them and then they see what happens. No, they usually take either cancer patients and then they didn't measure necessarily the mortality rates. They measure endpoints like how big the tumor is or how does it look like. And with those endpoints, there is this physician called Vinay Prasad. He has been writing this book on the effectiveness of cancer drugs, and he's mostly critical with that, saying that it may be incentivizing pharma to pursue these like less effective drugs. So again, rather than a simple story where the FDA is being too permissive or being too conservative, it may be that for some cases it's being too conservative, and for others it's being too permissive. Which again, I think this will be another interesting progress studies question. Actually breaking down the black box of the FDA and saying, okay, in which exact way should you change the FDA? What specific families of drugs should you change to actually get the most out of it as a regulatory entity?
Totally. No, that's good. So have you studied our healthcare system, or what makes great healthcare systems versus poor healthcare systems, and why is the US sort of uniquely bad, and what could be done to change that?
Yeah, so a few years ago, maybe 3 years, 4 years ago, I kind of looked into. I mean, I didn't look into enough depth to write like 50,000 words about it, but I think that there's this initial take that goes like, I guess the textbook case would be something like, well, like there is some kind of public goods or externalities problems around healthcare. Maybe people are not well enough informed about their own health to make choices about healthcare providers. There are other things like vaccination. That vaccination is an externality. So if it's up to people, they're not going to get vaccinated. There are these arguments that people make, claiming that it has to be a public system, and if it's not, then it's going to be super expensive and it's not going to work very well. But actually, if you look at things, you look at how different countries do it. I think that picture is not so simple. For example, one very simplistic thing people share is life expectancy in the US and healthcare expenditure. And it's like, oh, it seems like the US spends so much, doesn't really get results. Sure, but you have to account for various things. One, for example, is that things like obesity rates or diabetes rates in the US, they are quite high. Perhaps for reasons that everything seems to be very sugary. Everything has high fructose corn syrup in the US. You also have things like accidents, like the US. People in the US have lots of accidents of various kinds, both traffic accidents and accidents at home, that just increases their mortality risk. You also have things like that. Also, this statistics may also be biased by national level genetics. So, for example, countries like Japan or Spain are very long lived, and actually, probably the city that has more or less large city that has probably the most long-lived population, average life expectancy I could find is Madrid in Spain. It's more than Tokyo. It's like 80 something years on average. If you look at Hispanics in the US, they live longer than whites, or non-Hispanics, whites. Even even like if they're like lower in income, they still will live longer. So there's something to that. It may be diet, it may also be diet and not just the genetics, but there are all these factors that make it seem not so simple. There's also the fact I mentioned earlier about cancer rates. So again, the US healthcare system delivers better outcomes if you can afford them. Okay, but it's famously not very affordable. Why is that so? Then you get into other question. So one reason is that ideally you want the production of things to be tied to your consumption in terms of money. You want to easily see, okay, as a patient, I'm paying this much money and I'm getting this treatment. You don't really see that much in the healthcare system. Yeah, it's usually heavily intermediated first by the fact that you usually get a subsidized or a tax advantage insurance from your employer. You get this because of historical tax reasons in the US, but this means that there's less of an incentive for you to get an individual or for people to offer individual insurance, and for people to actually see in a more obvious way how much they're spending in healthcare. There are other things, like, for example, hospitals. Suppose you want to open a hospital in San Francisco to compete with the other ones. Well, you cannot just do that. You have to, this thing you have to get is called a certificate of need. You have to prove that there has to be one. And it's like, it's like you need permission. It's not like permission by default. You have to ask for that permission. And it may be, they may tell you, we already have enough hospitals. And it's like, yeah, but mine is going to be super cheap. And it's like, sorry. There are other things that you also have in the US, more so in other countries. You have lots of, the US in general is extremely in a way, legalized, or maybe that's not the right word, but it's very litigious. People really like to sue each other. And when you get lawyers and law into the picture, you also get cost inflation because people get defensive. So if you're an MD and your patient is not paying themselves, if their insurer is, why not just do loads of like MRIs and very more expensive things on them just to make super sure about what you are doing? The cost to you is minimal. The cost to the patient is minimal because the insurance is again there again in some cases. So you're again incentivized to do this. You also get other things within hospitals. So most hospitals in the US strangely are non-for-profit, even though some people question that they're really non-for-profit given the salaries they pay to their both board members and physicians. But again, one way because you may think that being non-profit means that they will try to keep costs down as much as they can, but not necessarily. You also have other things. Also from looking at international experience. For example, take eye surgery, for cataracts or something like that. So if you go to India, there is this chain of clinics called the Aravind Eye Clinic. And they are certified by a US-based agency as providing levels of care equal to the US that adjusted for labor costs, because of course, like labor in India will be cheaper, but adjusted for that, it's cheaper than what the US achieves. The way they achieve this is by making their hospitals in general into more of an assembly line. So if you're a surgeon, you're only ever going to do either one kind of operation or one part of one operation. So you are highly trying to do this one thing and doing extremely well. So you may get like one patient, you do operation, they get out, you get another patient, you do another operation, and you're operating over and over. This, I think, the secret sauce for efficiency in general, like one thing we know works across the board, is assembly lines, learning by doing and focusing on one thing at a time. If we will, maybe a comparative advantage. So by doing this, they can greatly reduce costs by making healthcare more of an assembly line. You also get, I guess, as an additional thing, you also get occupational licensing. So suppose that you just want to be an MD and just want to practice and just want to get going. Do you really need to go through like all this super lengthy learning process? Maybe not, maybe yes. But again, the reason it is that way. So if you go back in time to the way, this is the American Medical Association, the AMA. Before that, there was more freedom for people to practice medicine. People used to even like pull money together, and they would have like a group fee, like an MD or a doctor. So if you had like a trade union or some company, you have like the company doctor. So it was more like your personal doctor that you saw kind of all the time. And that was like free from these constraints. Now the AMA lobbied against these kind of arrangements. This is like, no, like doctors have to conform to our standards and they have to be taught in our way. And well, for that matter, the same is true for law. Like back in the day, practicing law was way easier. It was more accessible than it is now. Again, you got like this, the equivalent association in the US for lawyers, and they lobbied heavily to actually regulate and control the sector. There are some unclear things here too. So some people have argued that that one ingredient here is that MDs and doctors in the US have very high salaries compared to other like service workers. Some people argue that they are not if you compare them, but then you also can make the argument that maybe all the other highly paid service workers in the US are also, it's also due to all these systemic problems. So you're not comparing doctors against well-functioning sectors. You're comparing doctors against equally bloated sectors. This being, for example, finance or law in that case. So again, to recap so suppose again as a thought experiment, suppose. I think Brian Kaplan has this interesting essay called "For the Separation of Healthcare and State." Suppose everything is purely private, or suppose you have something like, if you're truly poor and you cannot afford it, then the state will cover that. If you go fully private, what happens? So Singapore has a system that again is not market based, but it's kind of what people argue that the market would evolve towards. It's a system where you're in a way forced to save. Hospitals have different levels of care. Like maybe as an entry level is very cheap. Like you get like not a very nice room. You don't get as many like goodies. If you pay more, then you get more things in the hospital. And to some extent, people who pay more are subsidizing for those who can pay less. And also probably if you could make one change, like to US healthcare to make it, Donald Trump is already making one good step here. He's making first hospitals to make their prices public, which is one step. But probably what you probably want to make is for things that are potentially very expensive, you probably want an insurance for that, because maybe the alternative is like saving lots of money just in case. But for things that are regular expenses, like various drugs, you probably want to make those have to be paid out of pocket most of the time. Those things are not really insurance. Those things are unexpected costs. Like it's not like the only outcome of that is you're being insulated from the cost of a thing. And again, deep down, it all comes down to a values question. Are you willing to tolerate that the system is not going to be saving the most lives as possible while being cheaper? Because that's the case there was this huge debate in the US, right, about like so-called death panels, of people deciding who lives and who dies and rationing funding. That's one way public systems ration costs. But again, if culturally you are not willing to say no to this, if you're going to say we're going to do as much as we can, no matter the cost, to save a life, then the outcome is increasing costs, and that again is like how do you convince people? How will you culturally change that? If someone is, let's say, 70, it's okay for the state to say we have done enough and you're on your own now. And because also a lot of healthcare expenditure is also concentrated on a few subset of people that are also quite elderly. This may sound quite maybe lacking in empathy or callous, like saying that. But again, I'm just saying that this is the way public systems do it. I'm not saying that it should be the way to do it. I'm saying that there are probably better ways of both getting more care, better care, and cheaper. But if you want like the easy solution to go public, like if you just magically make the US system like a pure a single payer, like just public, I don't expect costs are going to go down by much, if at all, because again, like you will need some kind of system like this to instead of the market, you need some entity to actually push the demand down. So this is kind of like a preliminary analysis. I may well be wrong in many of these things. There's also, of course, all of the discussion around the bone mold cause disease that maybe Alex Tabarrok argued that maybe it's just normal that as countries get rich, they spend more on healthcare. It may well be, but it's like you look at how many issues it has, and it's like, surely, okay, maybe if you fix all these things, it's not going to get 10x cheaper, but surely it's going to get so much cheaper, and maybe more cheaper than Alex Tabarrok thinks. So in any case, regardless of the effect we expect, we should fix these things as we see them.
Yeah. And do you want to say more about, Mark Andreessen and others point to sort of, housing, we're talking about healthcare, education as sort of being the things that have continued to go up. Do you know about, for like the moderate American, if those are the biggest costs, or what is sort of the pie chart of the biggest sort of expenses that the median American that they have, or any other things you want to say on either housing or education or elsewhere in terms of bending these cost curves down?
Yeah, I think definitely those are big items within the and across the entire income stratum in the US. Those sectors also, it's actually good to point at them together, because these are also sectors that are heavily labor intensive. So, and if you look at also actually, I said earlier that productivity growth, TFP, is slowing down. But if you break it down by sector, you may see that some sectors are going faster than others. And the sectors that tend to stagnate the most are healthcare, education, and housing. One reason for this, well, besides, of course, like housing regulations, is that you run with the limitations of what a single person can do. Like if you're building a house or if you're treating a patient, you cannot physically, as a human being, move your arms 10 times faster and do surgery 10 times as fast. You cannot just do that. That's a limitation of us. So to overcome that, you either need automation, like have robots do it for you, or you can still have humans, but then you need assembly lines. So in the case of housing, for example, suppose that you want to. So San Francisco has famously, compared to other major cities, doesn't really have a very high population density. Suppose you want to replace all the housing in San Francisco. How much would that take? Assuming there are no regulations stopping you from doing so. So one way you can accelerate this is that, well, couldn't you just have a factory and just churn out, just make houses on an assembly line, So there's this company in China. They do exactly that. They pre-manufacture lots of pieces and then they assemble inside everything that they need, and they have been able to I think it's like a 10 or 100x faster construction speeds for skyscraper kind of buildings. Now, these skyscrapers may look boring, as they are literally just more or less square, glassy pieces of construction, which also ties into the values question. So if you don't have regulations stopping you, if you can manufacture things in assembly lines, do you want everything to look more or less the same? People look like, no, we want diversity. In that case, you move towards a more one-of-a-piece kind of building, like a skyscrapers. Like each of them has their own fancy design by a famous architect. It's not like you design one. Well, it's not like you don't design one and then you make 100 copies of the same skyscraper so that you can learn how to build it faster. Except maybe in Hong Kong, and you see some faster construction speeds there. So that's a thing. I think one sector that maybe has managed to overcome this issue is the ship construction sector, as in the construction of large cargo ships and things like that. So if you look at the time it used to build large ships, it took off years and a long time. Now the way they are designed is that they are again designed, and they're also labor intensive because you have to manually, you have people actually riveting parts together, people managing the cranes actually put parts together, soldering different things. But what they do is that they actually split them in different sections, and they can manufacture the whole thing in parallel, and then just assemble. It's kind of in terms of tech, it's like a MapReduce approach to building ships, and that gets you the 100 or 10x improvement that you need to actually see tangible improvements. But not only that, I think going back to the regulation thing, there is this company called Factory OS. I think it was founded by A16Z, I recall, and they're trying to do something like this. But it is that if you go back to the 60s, 60% of all housing was built in factories. It was prefab housing, lots of it. We don't, well, I mean, I wasn't around back then, but I guess in the current discourse, people don't really think about that. Or if they were around, they didn't remember that. Or maybe they were not aware of that because you don't really know where your house came from or something. And then you wonder, well, okay, if factory housing is so great, how come it's not more widespread? Well, because you have the American House Building Association lobbying against that. You had them privileging mortgages for regular housing instead, and so having regulations against this kind of housing. And so it's not always that it's just science and progress slowing down. It's sometimes that even if, as Mark Andreessen, he wrote this article, it's time to build. Even if you do a call to actually people we should actually get our shit together and get building. Even if you're going to build, either it's so difficult that it's not worth it economically, or it's just outright impossible. As I said, if you're going to actually go and build a hospital, it's not just you can just do it. You have all of this thicket of regulations around you that prohibit you from actually building. And this is why I say that the cure for many of these ailments is probably going to involve a heavy dose of politics. You really need politics to unlock some of these avenues for progress. And I think that there is so Silicon Valley has been traditionally I say more or less away from politics. You have like, well, politics is kind of slow moving, and and with an Uber, so that you can just like do it, and then they will just approve your after the fact whatever you're doing. But I think that there is this trend now of people worrying about institutions. You have things like like Samo, or also Palladium magazine, everything around charter cities, which again, charter cities also in a way. This thing about everything is lost, we cannot fix it, so let's make new ones from scratch, which may well work. That may be the thing.
Totally. One of the things we talked earlier about is you would put more resources towards biology, encourage more people to go towards biology. Yeah. Where within biology should people focus, and do you think has most opportunity for life sciences? Within that?
I think that the point of biology, I think that the things most people want out of biology are cures for various ailments. If you look at, for example, what things we have managed to cure over time, one is, ironically enough, infectious disease. That has been going down a lot. Now we have COVID, so that's the kind of thing reverted. But the things that mostly that people want treated are things like cancer, diabetes, various forms of cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, Alzheimer's. All these conditions that people want treated. If you have all these conditions, you can say, well, okay, we should fund cures, drugs for these different things, or we should also fund, of course, tools that enable researchers to actually investigate these cures. But as a systemic approach, ultimately, the human body is tightly integrated, right? Like all these things kind of get worse at the same time. I mean, if you're young, like you rarely get cancer, diabetes, or cardiovascular disease. It's very, very rare. And even in children, like the kinds of cancer that children get are very different, and for different reasons that the ones that adults get. And so the question becomes, okay, well, obviously there is something going on here. It's not like all of these things are uncorrelated and you should research them on separate. So ultimately, I think that the one thing that should be tackled by biology funding is aging itself. And so aging is it's this process. So where we go from being more or less young, healthy, very resistant to like disease, to this other state where we progressively get worse and eventually die. And you can actually show that if you look at all these conditions, like all of these things that we want to cure, all of them, you can trace them back to a small set of things that correlate or that you can call aging at a molecular level. And then the thing is, well, our bodies already have mechanisms to repair themselves. It's only that they degrade or get worse over time, and there are other things like that. What if fixing a small set of things, by focusing on this small set of things, we could tackle everything in one go? So, for example, imagine this sort of experiment. Suppose that the only things you die from are cancer and cardiovascular disease, and that's it. Suppose you find a cure, and also suppose that they happen more or less at the same time. Suppose that you cure cancer completely. There's a pill that cures cancer. Lifespan is not going to change that much because you will still die from something else. So what you want to do is to actually find the root causes of all these things and fix them. Now, this science is extremely difficult, right? Because like the human body is so complex, so many systems. It's not like a car where you can like easily think about like all the parts and the way they are moving and actually write equations about very precise about their movement and things. You have like literally proteins stochastically colliding with each other and reacting in random ways. And it's like to think that you can actually fix that, it's very difficult. But I do think that that's probably the right focus as a general framework for funding in the area.
I want to get into aging and longevity, and that's a space that you've looked at and gone pretty deep in. Why don't you sort of walk through sort of your research a little bit, the discoveries that you've made, the sort of misconceptions people have on it. Why don't you just sort of unpack your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I guess about aging, I guess probably especially listeners of this podcast have probably already heard various things. There are various things people say that, if we manage to live longer, maybe we will either care less about life or we only give meaning to life because we eventually die or things like that. Now, I think that those arguments are really not that interesting. If you look at people, empirically, if you look at people that think they're going to live for a long time, there is this guy, Aubrey de Grey. He's a biogerontologist, and he's very optimistic. And he thinks that we are going to solve aging kind of fairly soon. So in effect, he's living as if he's going to live for a long time, perhaps. But he's really hardworking and he feels really motivated. So I don't think that should be a problem. I think that the top one misconception is that we cannot do much about the problem. It's kind of like a defeatist attitude. In this case, we just accept that that's life, and that we have to cope with it. And maybe that maybe there's some things we can do, like maybe you can change diet and exercise and things like that, but we cannot go beyond the very basics, that we will eventually get old and die, and as in maybe 80, 89, 100, maybe if you're very lucky, and that's it. So I think it's that one, well, there is no principle in physics that tells you that you cannot do that. There was this debate back in the day between Aubrey de Grey and Brett Weinstein, of all people, Eric Weinstein's brother, and others. And the conclusion from that debate was that, like, sure, like solving aging seems to be possible in principle, right? I mean, there is no like thing that prohibits you, but it's extremely hard, of course. Maybe a misconception might be that also the systems we have to repair ourselves and to counteract that are also very complex and very very have lots of redundancy. So it's not like we are in this like carefully balanced state, like we are young, and then suddenly we get out of balance, and then we suddenly get old, like from one day to another. No, it's a steady, slow decline. So the thing is that if these mechanisms more or less manage to keep you healthy and functional for decades, what if we just either repair some of the damage or get those mechanisms to work better to extend life? So someone might say, well, but eventually something is going to happen, and you're going to, like something, you get cancer. Well, you have like, if you look at the animal kingdom, you have like this kind of species of sharks, and they live for like 500 years or 300 years. Or like if you look at other animals like lobsters, like these tiny rats called the naked mole rats, they don't really get cancer much. And so the hope is that, well, it doesn't seem like we are condemned to have these things. And sure, this is all probabilistic. Probably whenever we get to a cure for cancer, let's say, that will be maybe like 99.9% of cancers. For the leftover, maybe we need to do something else. But at least systemically, it does seem like we can looking around us in animals, we can see that lifespan varies a lot. And then second, this is more on the experimental side, but looking at both like mice or worms and doing like some genetic engineering on them, we can get them to live, in the case of worms, 10 times longer, which is quite a lot. It seems possible in the case of worms, like with this tiny change, they get them to live so much more. With mice, it's not that easy. So what you usually find, and I guess this is also going back to the point about cancer and atherosclerosis that I said earlier. So if you look at the literature on aging, right? Like if you look at this literature, the way it looks like, it's like different people trying different interventions. So again, you may have, there is this, for example, this company called Unity Biotechnology, and they have this thing called senolytics, which are drugs that target this thing called senescent cells. They have cells that stick around, generating inflammation around them, which then leads to other things like atherosclerosis, cancer, and other stuff. Okay, so you can clear the cells, and you see an improvement in median lifespan, I think, and also in other various biomarkers of health. But for all these individual things, you don't usually see a huge improvement in maximum lifespan. That's really difficult to change. And this is probably happening because you need to have this systemic approach to all these causes at once. So if you manage to this worm, and you manage to like avoid it from getting cancer. But again, these worms don't really get cancer. It's only like in some specific cells. But if you manage to do that, then eventually something else is going to make the worm die. So you need this systemic approach. So currently the literature on aging is a structure around what is called the hallmarks of aging. This is a set of a few 6 or 7 things that have been found to correlate with aging, and some of them to actually cause aging as a primary thing. For example, one thing that's probably more or less known is telomeres. So telomeres get shorter as we age. Telomeres are these in our chromosomes. We have these like end caps at the end that when they get too short, the cells stop replicating and become senescent. And again, senescent cells generate this inflammation. So telomeres shorten because cells don't have, or the enzyme that would elongate telomeres, called telomerase, is not active in most cells. People think that the reason it is not active, it's not because it's damaged. It's our body does it on purpose. It turns it down. In theory, people speculate because if as a defense mechanism against cancer. So if there's a cancer cell and it's replicating very fast, the telomeres will get shorter, and eventually the cancer cell will stop replicating. So And this is why people, for example, Aubrey de Grey proposed, well, to cure cancer, we just need to, using something like gene editing, actually take out telomerase from everywhere, for all of our cells. Not just because ultimately all of our cells, they share the same, well, most of them, they share the same DNA, but but a neuron is not the same as a cell in your eye or in your muscle. So they have they have like different regulatory programs, so they can turn on and off different genes. And so most cells, other than the stem cells in our bodies, they don't express this gene, even though they have it there. It's only when it mutates that it gets expressed and lets cancer spread. So the worry is, okay, if you just give telomerase back, you may get cancer. Or if you take it out, conversely, if you take it out and telomeres keep getting shorter, then you get senescence, inflammation, and also you also get cancer anyway. So you need a systemic approach. So you say, okay, telomeres is one thing. Another thing is a stem cell depletion. So as we in our bodies we have stem cells. These stem cells they are able to replicate. They're able to split in two. One is a stem cell, and the other one is a cell from the tissue they are in. So and then that way they can replenish some of the cells that get lost in that tissue. Well, over time they get degraded, and both in number. And also in a way we may call the effectiveness of the stem cell, how good they are generating healthy cells of the tissue, gets degraded. You also see things in cells like again, I mentioned like cells are basically proteins colliding randomly with each other. Sometimes they get stuck in ways that cannot be unstuck easily. And then that causes problems in the cell. The concentrations of the different proteins in the cell stop being the ones that are required for health. This is called loss of proteostasis. And you can go on and on about all these things. I guess maybe as a more helpful conceptual framework, you can think of aging as maybe two components. One is noise, and the second one is more of an evolutionary programmed aging kind of thing. For example, the idea here is not that we evolve to get age on purpose. It's that for example, that the mechanisms that are useful when you are young are not so useful, at least evolutionarily, when you are older. So, for example, if we evolve to live to like 40 or 30 years in prehistoric times, we wouldn't have evolved a system to fight cancer or like to delay cancer longer than that, because it wouldn't make sense, right? Like evolution doesn't really worry about what happens after you are dead. Likewise, I think maybe the most striking thing that is kind of on the program end of things is the involution of the thymus. This is kind of something that I've been really looking into recently. So the thymus is this gland that is located between your lungs. What it does is that you get from the bone marrow in your bones, you get these hematopoietic stem cells. These are cells that become red blood cells and white blood cells, like T cells for the immune system. So these cells then go to the thymus to get trained, to learn to recognize antigens, pathogens, and not to attack your own body. And then they are released to your bloodstream, and then they can effectively fight. They can fight cancer, senescent cells, and infection, of course. What happens? Well, as you age, this thing becomes a lump of fat. It stops being useful and becomes just a bunch of fat. Our argument for that seems to be that it's really, in terms of energy, the immune system is very expensive. Like keeping all these immune cells around is very expensive. And then evolution just shuts it down after a while. And the reasoning would be that suppose that you are in a hunter-gatherer tribe, you're more or less in the same area. After you're exposed to the same pathogens for a while, you develop immunity and memory T cells. Your immune system already knows how to handle those. So there is no point in keeping around all these cells that can recognize new infections and kill them. And likewise, it doesn't really make sense for evolution to actually keep these for senescent cells or cancer, because again, you are not going to be living for that longer. So evolution shuts down this thing. But then again, it's like, okay, can we just bring it back? Can we just make it younger? Not just like kind of undo any damage, just like literally make it the same as it used to be when it was young. And so there is research. There are various lines of research here. So some people say, okay, why does it shrink? I think, why exactly at a molecular level? What is it causing it to shrink? Can we just target that? And sure, there is this protein that's called transcription factor FOX1N, which is that as you age, it makes it shrink. And if you inject that at least in mice, the thymus grows again in old mice, and you see things like inflammation going down, and like so-called naive or like T cells that can react to new threats. Those ones go up in the body. You also see the ratio between. So in our immune system, we have both an innate and an adaptive component. So we have both this component that kind of learns and this component that is more kind of garbage collecting things around. And so as we age, we get more of this garbage collection and less of this adaptive and responsive system. And when you regrow the thymus, you also get more of these adaptive system cells getting back into action. And so in humans, but again, people say, oh, things maybe only work in mice, but does it work in humans? So in humans, it's more difficult to test these things. In mice, you can inject things into them, stem cells, you can do transplant of thymus. Everything shows everything is aligned in the right direction. It seems to work. But in humans, it's harder to do this test. So what they did, there was just this recent paper, and what they did is to give people human growth hormone, DHEA, which is something that some bodybuilders take, some zinc. So zinc is also something that as we age, we absorb less zinc. And it's also crucial for the immune system functioning, some zinc. And then they also gave people metformin, because human growth hormone can make you more prone to diabetes, and metformin counters that. Okay, so what they found is that again, these various biomarkers, inflammation goes down, and so on and so forth. And in some of the subjects of the test, they were like older people. Their hair was kind of white, and it became more kind of gray. It's kind of like it began to kind of look more younger, the hair. This is more on the anecdotic, but very visible change. However, the way they measure, or the way they think, they show that they were actually able to reverse some of the aging was using something called epigenetic clock. This is also something I wrote about recently in my blog. The idea here is that, as I said, if the DNA in our genes, in our chromosomes is like the program, or like that we execute, the epigenome is kind of like the metadata that is used to interpret the DNA so that each cell can do its own thing. So as we age, this epigenome, so the epigenome sounds very mysterious, but it's just like a bunch of molecules stick to the DNA, or other molecules called histones that also have these like little tags attached to them. So as we age, these little tags, they seem to change in the same way for most people. And so this guy from UCLA, Asif Horvath, he's like, well, can we use a very simple machine learning model? It's a linear model, very simple one, to estimate how old someone is just from looking at their epigenome and nothing else. And they managed to find a correlation between just looking at that and age of like over like 80 or 90%, like extremely like plus minus 3 years accurate. Not only that, on later work, they show that with the same approach, they are able to show this so-called the Green age clock. They're able to show how many extra years of life you have left. That's what the clock predicts. And the hope is that if I test you today and you are, let's say that epigenetically or biologically you are, let's say, 28 years old, next year you should be 29 years old. But if I apply this therapy to you and you are next year 28 years old, it means that you kind of wind back the clock by 1 year or more. So in this case, they did it by 2 years or so, which is quite intriguing. Now, when they do this in mice, they don't live forever or anything. They live a bit longer. They're not healthy, but it's not a comprehensive cure. There's more work to be done here in that field. So what? I guess going back earlier to the point about organizations like DARPA that try to coordinate different fields, it seems that the cure for aging, or the reason why maybe some people are pessimistic about a cure for aging, is that most papers try one thing. If you try one thing, maybe you're only addressing either one cause or something that is not a root cause, something that's just like downstream of that. And so you're fixing that, but then something else is killing you anyway. So you find this very funny phenomenon in these papers, so-called compression of morbidity. You find that if you plot how many individuals are alive at one point in time, it more or less looks more or less like everyone is alive 100%, and then they drop and then you die. When you give these treatments, it's more or less the same. Maybe they start dropping off a bit later, but at the end, by the same time, everyone is, as in by the natural lifespan, they tend to also drop off, meaning that you fix one thing, but everything else was not fixed. So what you probably need in the field of aging is something like this, something that says, okay, like I think seriously, what are the root causes here? What is going on? And because you could say, okay, senescent cells. Senescent cells are, yeah, sure, you can target them in the clinic to fix cataracts or to tackle arthritis. And for example, Lord Deming invested in Unity, that company, and that's a great thing. But you wonder, okay, why are there so many senescent cells? Is it that we're generating more as we age, or is it that we are not killing enough as we age? Where is the imbalance? So instead of just like looking at things that happen to make you feel or seem younger, you have to think about what are the ultimate root causes. And I think that this is probably going to be just two things. As I said, going back to the beginning, noise. I think when cells replicate, maybe they don't fully replicate perfectly, or the epigenome doesn't fully. It's not easy to maintain it through life. So you need to fix that. And then second, you have this program component. Maybe it's that your body doesn't really want you to have a big thymus and doesn't really want you to take in zinc, because also another thing that apparently zinc may be also useful for, actually lack of zinc may be more useful to tackle pathogens you have already seen, but not so for newer ones. There are some papers that speculate why it might not be. And I guess that to drive the point home that this kind of program aging thing matters, if you look at one of the reasons these small worms, C. elegans, one of the reasons they die is because their intestines, as they age, well, their intestines are initially, they are taking some fat from the body to kind of feed and generate eggs from which new worms will then hatch. But as they age and there are no more eggs to generate, this mechanism continues working, even though the worm is not eating as much. It's kind of like it's not moving as much. But this mechanism continues acting. In a way, the worm is eating itself but because there are no eggs, it just generates a lump of fat within itself. So you have all these mechanisms that sound like they're great when you're young, but not so when you're older. So if you look at, let's say, things or people say when they talk about aging, some people will talk about things like caloric restriction or fasting, intermittent fasting, ketogenic diet, or vegan diets, or even some people carnivore diets, which I'm kind of not so sure about. But at least at a molecular level, we do know that those things do work. I think it's not just that people feel better. It's that if you go at the molecular level, there's this protein called mTOR, or called molecular target of rapamycin, and it's effectively it acts as a nutrient sensor. So if you don't have enough nutrients, this may mean you are not eating enough proteins, or you are not eating enough food. You're hungry. So this thing becomes down-regulated or less active, which means that then in turn that causes the cell to do more autophagy, which is it will more readily destroy or like eat its own organs and make new ones. Again, going back to how you rejuvenate organization, like keep high turnover, the cell begins to do more of this exact same thing. And there are some drugs like rapamycin, for example, that can directly target this without having to do any fasting. This thing again seems to work. Like it's difficult to find one intervention that if you try it in mice, in worms, in flies, in humans, in monkeys, it works. Rapamycin seems to work everywhere you test it and have like sizable effects. Maybe in mice, maybe it's like maybe 20-30% maximum lifespan or something like that. Now, some people are worried about rapamycin, particularly because rapamycin, if taken in high doses, is an immunosuppressant. So rapamycin it's used for the use of rapamycin usually is to, when you get a transplant, is used to avoid rejection of the transplant. But apparently, if you use it in a low dose on a periodic cycle, it may actually be helpful. Although you will need a prescription anyway. It's not even though you can prescribe drugs for off-label use. It's not like it's not easy for them to say, okay, I'm going to prescribe this because of aging, even though you seem to be fine for your age, which means that you're not really great for it in any case. Some other interesting stuff. So I guess that maybe people are familiar with the TV series Silicon Valley, right? Like there is this idea of the blood boy. It's the idea that you can take blood from young individuals and put it in old individuals and use that as a means of rejuvenation. And there is something to that. So there is this very old studies that they actually co-joined like an old and a young rat together, and they found that seemingly the old rat seems to get younger and the young one seems to kind of get older. So that kind of like looked promising. So more recently, they did. There are some trials people have done with this same thing. Only that instead of something as crude as stitching together to animals, instead they either inject a blend of plasma factors of plasma. If you take out from your blood, all it's like immune system cells, red blood cells. What is more left over is more or less plasma. If you put like things that you think are in the young and you put them in the old, again in mice, you can see that the tissues, when you look at them, they look younger. When you cut them, those wounds heal faster after that. And even though there is still no data for experiments on longevity, on another trial, if we are willing to believe this stuff about the epigenetic clocks, if we are willing to believe that, they did a study using that was a study actually. They found that they were greatly rejuvenated. And now they published the paper without publishing how much longer they lived, so it's still a bit unclear how much it worked. But again, this kind of shows that there was something in the blood that maybe it's making them older. And our recent paper kind of seems to show that maybe it's not so much what is in young blood, but maybe it's what is in old blood. So if you take an old mice and just take half of the blood out of the plasma, and then put like water with some salt and albumin. This is like the nutrients and minerals that used to be in the blood. Just put them back, put that bit of that, nothing else. That also seems to improve health, without any young individual involved. And the mechanism also might be that the body is saying, hey, we are missing loads of things in blood. We have to make more of them. And when it's making more of them, it's making newer ones, which are maybe because they're just like freshly made, they are younger, instead of just like keeping around the ones that you used to have.
Totally. What do we think about the cultural problem around, many people are averse to extending lifespan? Like, do you think that that's something that we'll just get over as we get closer to the technology? What do you think about the cultural resistance there? Because I think that's holding a lot of people back now from maybe working on it or for it having more money or government money. Or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that kind of meme or idea, I think is probably going back. I think that at least perhaps because I'm biased, I mean, most people I usually talk to, like younger people, they usually accept the idea that yes, I mean, like you don't want to, like dying is bad. It's big news. But maybe some people they're concerned instead that they have to live forever, but that's also not the case. So if anything, it will be optional, right? Like you could say, okay, I've lived 1,000 years or whatever. I don't want to keep going anymore. Fine. It's not like you're going to be forced to do so. And for other people, maybe I guess what Aubrey de Grey, he calls it like the I think the death trance or something. He argues that because aging or death is so prevalent, like for all of our history, we haven't been able to get over that. We developed this idea that it's actually okay. It's like a Stockholm syndrome of some kind. Like you actually think that the bad thing is actually good, and we begin to think that maybe aging or maybe maybe it's good to have like death so that it gives meaning to your life or things like that. I think when you get to the specific arguments around that and the empirics of what people say, that like say, okay, if you live forever, you are going to get lazy and you're going to be playing video games all the time or something like that. I mean, if you're living longer, you can actually do that. It's like you can say, okay, this year I'm going to be in a Buddhist monastery. Next year I'm going to play video games. Next year I'm going to do a startup. Next 10 years I'm going to work at like Twitter. Next 50 years I'm going to be a researcher. Next 60 years back to the Buddhist monastery. So it's not like living longer is going to reduce your motivation. It's going to enable you to do more things. So it puts more of an effort on you to actually decide what you want to do with your life. So life currently it's more or less structured. You grow up, you go to school, you get a job in one thing, you usually stick to the one thing, then you retire and then you die. But with this, that doesn't necessarily hold anymore. You can have it's very easy to have various careers. And I said, this is in the very, very long term, assuming that, because I think nothing of what they mentioned, so everything I've mentioned more or less would get you a few extra years of healthy life. It's not like we are going to live forever tomorrow. But in the extreme case, I think that'll be something like that. So I think that it's probably a meme that would just die as people get replaced, which again, it's also maybe another concern. So this thing that Max Planck said, that science advances funeral by funeral. That it's not like people adopt new ideas, it's that all people die. It's young people that adopt the new ideas and then they spread them. So some people say, well, if people live longer, like and moral values, and maybe if we are only more responsive to arguments when we are younger, and our views become fossilized to the age, we're going to end up with maybe the people that are kind of in the commanding heights of our societies, in politics and business and places, not being replaced by younger people with newer ideas. Now, this might not be so bad, because I mean, if you are truly rejuvenating, including the brain, maybe some of that lost flexibility is regained. Yeah, one thing. But maybe you may also need to actually have structures that are more conducive to replace them. I don't know. In any case, I think that that like other worries, like for example, some people worry about overpopulation. That if we just take more to die or just die, then we just will overpopulate the planet, and it'll be a catastrophe. It says that those things will be so far into the future that the solutions we can think for them right now probably won't have to do with actual solutions that actually tackle those problems in the future. It'll be like I guess there are so many more horses in the streets now. What are we going to do with all the manure? Well, nothing, because there are no horses anymore. So that may be it.
Totally. Let's segue into education. What are sort of the non-obvious challenges that you see, or opportunities, or how do you think about either, we talked about higher ed a bit, but just the problems in education, maybe K through 12, and how do you think about some of the opportunities there? Or how do you think about that?
Yes, because education, I think, is kind of popular these days. Some people are kind of like trying to either improve education, both presential and also remote education, trying things like homeschooling. They look at higher ed and say like, hey, can we improve this? So my views, or maybe my high-level model for education, is that the way it currently works now is probably not ideal for the outcome it's intended to achieve, namely to instill knowledge to people. So is that so Bryan Caplan, I think, is mostly right that education acts as a signal. That for example, I have 2 master's degrees in aerospace engineering and mechanical engineering. No one has ever asked me for those degrees. They could, but maybe I'm lying or something. But with those degrees, even though the jobs you get with those degrees, like let's say software engineering, don't have anything to do with like building internal combustion engines, but they certify that you are a hardworking, smart person willing to work on the same thing for a long time, and that's a quality that's desirable in an employee. Now, of course, some people may claim, well, but maybe you are learning some like high-level thinking skills or something. Well, maybe, there's some of that, but it's not the key thing that is coming from education. Maybe like 60 or 70%, I think Caplan says, is the signaling effect. Ultimately, I think this happens because at the cognitive level, if you want to get good at something, you have to mostly do that one thing. So the idea that let's say that playing chess is going to get you better at music or biology, it's not true. It's literally not true. Like there is very little evidence of so-called transfer learning in humans. And so all of the things you have studied that you are not using right now may well be wasted time to some extent. Some things may be useful, like if you learn how to learn effectively, that's a useful skill that you may develop in regular education for sure, but you may also develop it in elsewhere. So besides education itself, as in kind of like a starting point, there's also the point that looking not at higher ed, but at like K-12 education and education for kids are being forced to go to school. Like it's not like they go there because they want. So there is this point that Mason Hartman, here from Twitter, she makes the point that schools are like little jails where kids are forced to go. Now, I think that kids, that most people in the education ecosystem are not really thinking about their situation. Like kids are not like mostly like, oh, this is so awful. Like no, school is a nice place where you meet other kids and you play with them, and like maybe we'll get you a job. Like what you're doing will somehow let you getting a job. So it's not that bad. For some kids, for sure. For some kids, it's awful. I mean, it's a boring place where you are not really learning useful things. You could be learning more on your own and things like that. So definitely having escape valve, making it possible for kids that want to escape the current system and learn on their own. I think that's definitely should be an option, and that's the case of a homeschooling. So if you wanted to, I guess maybe it is more of a moral point that you shouldn't force people to do things they don't want to do. The case, again, the usual rationale when you want to do that is when is paternalism justified? The general argument I think is valid is that when people systematically regret something that they did in the past, then you're justified in being paternalistic with them. I think that's probably the only case. Like, I don't know, like suppose that you just want to eat sweets and when you're a kid and vegetables because you don't like them. But then suppose that most people that grow up like that end up obese and with diabetes. And it's like, oh, had I known about this when I was young, I wouldn't have done this. Well, if people are like that, then you're justified in restricting people's choices, but only in that case. Now, with education, what is the justification for, say, teaching geography or Spanish, for that matter? I mean, most people, I guess it's something that Kaplan documented, most people forget about their second language they learn. It may be an interesting conversation piece that, oh, you know how to say hello in Spanish and stuff, but people don't really become proficient in that unless they have a special interest in that one thing. So the reason these things are taught in schools is one, so the teachers that teach them, they care about those things. They study them and then they think they're important. So of course they want to teach them. Second, they think that maybe it's going to be somehow helpful in the future. Somehow maybe it helps you think. It seems plausible, right? Like it doesn't sound like it's nonsense. But again, if you look at research, it doesn't seem to bear out. So suppose that you have an alternative model. Suppose that instead you teach math, you teach reading and writing, kind of the basics to get going for most things. Maybe you teach some maybe basic physics, some philosophy, some like way of thinking, maybe some things around good argumentation, what is a good argument, what is a good fallacy, spotting issues in argumentation, maybe some things around self-regulation, noticing where you're angry or feeling something that is leading you to be thinking less clearly, maybe some of that, which is kind of broadly useful. But then what? Maybe you want to just give people some free space to actually explore anything they want. If people say, well, you have to teach kids music just in case they are interested in music and they want to pursue that career. Sure, maybe, but you have to teach everyone and they have to teach a full year of that. Maybe not. Maybe you can have like shorter taster sessions of that one thing that kids can then pick up. Okay, so that's for the kind of maybe the more interesting question is maybe not so much what's the best way to learn something, but it's more what should be learned in the first place, which I guess is less talked about. Because sure, like if you want to learn something, like there's this literature that I can discuss that goes into what's the most effective way of getting knowledge into your head. But why should you put knowledge into your head in the first place? If you're a weird person like me, you want knowledge for the sake of knowledge. In that case, you just want the knowledge. But if you just don't care about the thing you are forced to learn, that maybe you just don't need it. You shouldn't be forced to efficiently learn something useless for you.
Totally. Talk about Bloom Sigma. Why that's interesting.
Yeah. So there's this phenomenon. So this phenomenon called Bloom's Two Sigma. So the idea here is that suppose you have already agreed that you want to teach something. You want your students to learn something. So the most useful or robust way we have to get people to learn is using a personal tutor. So having one expert with you that both knows what you know and also knows more or less the way you think and the way I think in which ways you get stuck, and they can help you exactly in a very individualized way to advance. So if this is this thing gets the I guess in the original studies, this guy Harold Bloom back in a few decades ago. So he found that with tutoring you find like huge effects in getting students to learn certain things. Fine, but tutoring doesn't scale. Like you need one person to tutor you. So how do you make tutoring scale? How do you distill what is useful from one-to-one tutoring into something that can be readily extended? And so he found this thing called well, I guess that's the Bloom's Two Sigma problem: finding something that is as effective or has an effect as large as the Two Sigma effect that you get from tutoring. So he found a few things. So he found maybe the core component of what he found is called mastery learning. So the idea here is that when teaching something, you break it down into a logical progression of steps built upon the previous one. Seems reasonable enough. But then you don't go to the next step until at least 80 or 90% of the material is perfectly mastered. Like you don't leave any gaps in the understanding of the students. You can do this either for the whole class, in which case some students will be doing like remediation or remedial classes to actually study the material again and try to do it again, while other students will be doing like so-called enrichment activities or doing more like open-ended random stuff. Or you can do it on an individual way where each student will do it advance at their own pace. So some will finish earlier and some will finish later. This has been tested both with regular like K-12 education, also for disadvantaged kids, also in higher education too. I mean, higher education for like things like training surgeons. So it seems like a pretty robust thing. Now, the effect is not quite 2 sigma. It's not as large as Bloom originally found. So usually, as for this whole literature, people trying to look for ways to improve the way we learn is kind of spotty and not great. It's not like probably the average. There was a study that the average effect in learning outcomes from hundreds of randomized controlled trials of education is like 0.04. It's like nothing. It's very small. Only a few things seem to work. So we have this thing about mastery learning. Mastery learning, by the way, it seems to work better for disadvantaged kids. So it seems that if you have more like higher capabilities and IQ, maybe you are able to figure out or monitor yourself more than otherwise. But okay, that's one way. I guess this still requires humans in the loop. As in, you still need a teacher that has been trained in this whole paradigm of teaching. What if you could use software to do the same thing, right? So this is an idea that well, I guess the easiest or the simplest version of this is to use a space repetition system. So maybe people are familiar with the work of Michael Nielsen and Andy Matuszak. So they built this built-in website, Quantum Country, that teaches quantum mechanics and embeds in the it's a comic book or website. It embeds in the work itself cards that prompt you to actually think about things you just learned, to actually constantly remind you and keep fresh the knowledge in your mind. Again, this thing works. It's also the base of things like Anki or flashcards to actually keep constant exposure to the material you actually want to commit to memory. This is kind of like one way you can do it in software, and you can use it to learn something. It's unclear when you want to use these things, because, for example, suppose you want to learn how to program. I usually program in Python. I never use such system for learning. I use it all the time. So because I use it all the time, it's more or less memorized already. I think it mostly works either for things that you just want to learn for curiosity that you're not going to use, or things that you expect you will probably need, but maybe not now, or things that maybe are adjacent to your area of research that maybe are not, as you're not looking into this right now. Or of course, if you want to impress your friends with your broad knowledge of saying, oh, in 1965, the 4th of January, this guy invented that. That sounds very impressive. You can also do that with SRS. Okay, but you can go further than that. So surely one can wonder, if you can have human tutors, why cannot you just have software that does everything they do, having a module that monitors how students learn and a model that monitors what they know, and then they can suggest interesting questions to the student, give them the right problem sets, and so on. But there's also a small literature on this, on the so-called automated education systems, and maybe the key learning from this is that they are difficult to make. You need a lot of domain knowledge to actually make the systems. So, for example, if you wanted to make a system to learn, let's say, quantum mechanics effectively beyond, let's say, the Quantum Country, you probably need like an actual quantum mechanics professor, a bunch of them, and also experts in education working together to actually build the system and think of like, oh, if the student asks this question or if the student thinks in this way, we should actually do this sort of thing. And maybe then how do you model knowledge in your students, and how do you know both what they know and how they know what they know, so you can actually debug their thinking? That's really hard problem. The most promising thing here is a study that DARPA keeps showing up, that DARPA did for the US Navy back in, I think, the year 2005 or 6 or so. What they did was to actually build one such digital tutor, the digital tutor program it was, to teach like IT technicians for like aircraft carriers, like destroyers and other ships. And they found that actually across various trials and measured in various ways. So the specific way they measured the students was a knowledge test. It's like tested them like just like pure knowledge questions. Also a case study test. They actually took previous case studies of the things they had to solve, and they were more like open-ended. And also an oral examination with experts. So it's like 3 different assessments. And they found that the effects are so large that they sound implausible, so large that the students were better than their instructors, that people that had like years of experience are doing the same thing. It sounds really incredible. So, and again, this sounds very strange also because even the studies seem robust. I mean, they repeated these things, it's multiple measurements. So it seems plausible, but if it's so plausible, why haven't they followed up? Why isn't there a startup doing this at scale? Why are not public education systems? They could develop one such system and then deploy it to all their schools. Why are they not doing that? I think one, it might be just because of lack of knowledge. They don't know these things exist. Second, lobbying. Teachers probably don't want to be replaced, which is something I learned also from my past startup life. And then lastly, because maybe you need all this like domain knowledge to actually build these systems. Incidentally, I met once with a DARPA program manager, and I asked him about this thing, and then this thing he knew about it, and he was going to look about it, but he actually never came back. Maybe I should follow up, but it has like more of it's like a known thing at DARPA. This thing is there and it worked, but no one knows what happened next or what they haven't followed up with this thing. Which again sounds very suspicious, but maybe it's just one case where the thing that DARPA was meant to do, like push the frontiers and get these things from academia into broad application, it's one thing that maybe they have only done it partially, and maybe there's a market there for someone to actually go and do it. I think that probably if you wanted to, if it were possible somehow to like lobby a large education system, maybe this thing is extremely expensive to build. But once you build a general tutor for math and reading, then it's done. Like, and you can deploy to all the schools. Maybe you can have an international collaboration to building one system like this, and then you can kind of spread the costs across many actors.
Let's talk about the entrepreneurial state. It's a book you covered a while ago. Why don't you talk about what that book is trying to do, any misconceptions around it, and where you agree or disagree?
Yeah, so the entrepreneurial state was published by Italian economist Mariana Mazzucato actually a few years ago now. And this book, what it seems to say is that actually the state matters a lot for innovation, and that we shouldn't like discount the role of the state. And that even, I mean, you can add other claims like state is required for innovation. Some things would not have happened without the state, or Apple and the iPhone were added, or Google are there thanks to the state. And then other claims like actually Google and Apple and so on, they should pay back to the state for all these investments. I guess this literature can be framed in the context of recent debates about industrial policy, that people are really getting really excited about that. I'm not so enthusiastic about that. I think that there's a legitimate case to be made that it worked in the East Asian countries. But when people say that Western countries got rich with industrial policy, that's as far as I've seen in the literature, the consensus is that no, that's fake news. That it doesn't go that far. The real estate, if we want to understand what it does, there are two things. One is that the book itself says that it's meant to be kind of a pamphlet meant to instill policy change and discussion. It's maybe not meant so much as an academic work as such, and also and you can also see this from like the language it uses. So to put it in the way Tyler Cowen would say, the aim of this book is to raise the status of the state within the innovation ecosystem. Of course, like it will be extremely naive and wrong to think that innovation is just people in their garages, it's like doing stuff. I've talked about the important role that DARPA has played, the NIH. Those things cannot be neglected. But then if you look at some of the concrete examples that she gives, she's going perhaps way too far. So if you take the iPhone, for example, so she may say, oh, like Apple, let's say Apple. Back in the day, like the state made an investment in Apple, and that was really entrepreneurial. Okay, fine. If you go into the reference, this is actually a common theme in the book. If you go to the citations she gives, sometimes the citations contradict directly what she is saying. So in this case, what happened was that there was this bank called this was the Chicago. Don't remember the name, but this bank gave a loan to Apple. This loan happened to be guaranteed by some government program. That was it. But it wasn't even that the loan was given to Apple at the very beginning. So Apple already had gotten a lot of funding from private investors. So it's not even that you can argue that Apple needed this thing to exist. So you cannot say that they needed that funding intrinsically, that without the state, no one would have funded that thing. for the iPhone in particular, so if you think about it, so what made the iPhone so great? I mean, the iPhone, I'm more of an Android person, but the iPhone was marked basically a beginning and an after in smartphones. Like you had like everything we see now is they're probably a spiritual descendants of the iPhone. But the reason the iPhone it was such an achievement was not necessarily the thing she talks about, which I will describe in a moment, but it's a combination of design and integration of software and hardware. So all the other manufacturers, everyone had access to kind of the same hardware. So you could potentially, if you were Samsung, you could have built your own iPhone without any further basic research. But it was Apple that actually did that. So the reason Matsukata might say that the iPhone was due to the state is that it's just, for example, things like GPS, for example, or Siri. So Siri was developed at this Stanford Research Institute, which gets public funding. And Siri, I think it's a good case of it. Siri was directly a case of the state investing in something and then getting it. But again, Siri, how core is Siri to the iPhone? It's more of an extra. It's more of an extra feature. More looking at more tangible things, like if you look at semiconductors, if you look at the chips that actually go into the iPhone. Like sure, you can also again make the case. I mentioned earlier this research consortium, Sematech, that was half public funded, and you can also make the case that the U.S. Air Force played a huge role in the birth of the semiconductor industry. Sure, you can say that, but then that kind of sounds like one that without that investment, you'd have gotten anywhere. It's like, are you saying that this breakthrough technology of broad application that was actually also being used in other industries too wouldn't have gotten anywhere without this stimulus from like the Air Force and these microchips? So I think there is a case to be made that some investment from the state made some things happen earlier than what would otherwise have happened. But I think that she doesn't really make a case for the stronger argument that they would have never have happened in that case. So likewise, many of the other things she mentions are things that she wants to paint the state as an entity that is actively almost like a single entity that takes risks and is entrepreneurial. And it's like, well, I mean, it's not really like the state has access to tax funding and also to debt financing in huge amounts. It's not like if you're a VC, like you have to be very, very careful about your funding. If not, you're still bankrupt. You run out of money. Like you cannot defraud your LPs forever. The state can keep going for more. So it's not really taking those risks as much. If you look at Google, for example, it's like, oh, what's the origin of Google? So well, first, Google was not even the first search engine. Before Google, you had loads of them. They kind of died for different reasons. The algorithm that Google used was not even that much of a wild innovation. The algorithm that Baidu in China uses when it was born, it's similar kind of to the one that Google uses. So it's not like it was only able to be discovered in that one place. But more that, Google was developed by that Sergey and Larry while they were working, this is true, for a program that's called the Digital Libraries Initiative. That was, as many programs are, publicly funded. But Google was not directly a contribution to this program. It was something that maybe was inspired by this. But this is more akin to saying, okay, you're a postdoc, you're in a university, you're publicly funded, and you come up with this invention. Was the state being entrepreneurial, or was it just like the state just has more of a supporting role? That's saying, okay, we're going to fund all of your academics, and then that kind of sets the ground for you to have your ideas. And who is really taking the risk and having the ideas ultimately? It's actually people that are in the on the ground, not like the state. Even in the case of ARPANET, let's say, so ARPANET was coordinated by DARPA, and then ARPANET led to the modern internet. But saying that the internet is a state creation completely devalues the role of internet service providers, all the work that went into building the submarine cables that actually transmit most of the traffic, all the internet protocols that were developed in various places, and many of these things, it wasn't like a mission-oriented program to design and create something. It was more like people happen to get ideas in their places. So if you look at the WWW, the protocol, the World Wide Web, at CERN. Well, CERN is a large hadron. It's a particle collider establishment. So he came up with this idea while he was working at that. It was not the intention of the funding of that place to come up with this idea. And likewise goes for touchscreens. So touchscreens were also born in academia. So actually maybe I forget, maybe in a national lab. But they were researching something completely different. And to make that job easier, they invented those touchscreens. So I guess that the ultimate, the way we should see everything together is that we shouldn't go as far as Matsukato says, where Apple is actually or Google are like milking the state and actually exploiting the risks that the state are taking. Is more of the way innovation is structured is that states think there's a public goods problem. You get extra funding, it gets broadly distributed. No one captures the state. It's not meant to be captured. As in, when companies use publicly funded research, it's not like there is a contract that says if you use this, you have to pay this much money. You could perhaps do so. So Matsukato suggests doing something like that. But if you want to do that, you cannot retroactively say, okay, Apple, you have benefited from this research, now you have to pay. It's like, but we didn't sign anything. The research was explicitly made publicly available. So I think that one thing Matsukato is saying is probably going too far. Also, in renewable energy, this one is quite funny. So Maria Matsukato, in addressing this chapter, briefly speaking, she says that the state has been behind most of the push behind renewable energies. And at some point, she cites one report from Bloomberg that says that seems to show that the state is by far the biggest funder here. But actually, she basically mixed things like different kinds of capital that people use. Like it's very different to have like debt financing with like risky, like more like VC stuff. And it's like, and she was even on Twitter publicly, she was called out by the author of the report. She was like, look, Mariana, you are not reading this properly. And she was like, yeah, but that's not a serious way of doing your research. And finally, so Mariana Matsukato also, when she's assessing the relative contributions of state and the private sector, she tends to contrast two models. One will be more a rich system or ecosystem of innovation where you have like companies at state, various consortia, things like DARPA, versus an almost autistic model of the private sector where you just have companies and that's it. But those are not really the alternatives. Like you also have, like I was mentioning earlier, these like focused research organizations. They can be public. You can make them in a DARPA way. They can also be private. Like there is no reason they need to be public. I think there is no special sauce that the public sector is putting in there. The special sauce is that they happen to have loads of money, and also because they fund a lot of academia, it's natural that a lot of that basic research is effectively publicly funded. Although that's also a tricky question. Like in the US, it's like half of the funding is publicly funded, half of basic research, half of it is publicly funded, half of it is privately funded, and will vary a lot by sectors. Yeah, so that's the idea. So I guess the model I would see I would looking for the state is more of a supporting role. I think it should leave it to private initiative and the markets to actually figure out what's the best use for resources like this. The state can play maybe some coordination role, and I would call this more the supporting state rather than the entrepreneurial model that Mariana Matsukato would seem to be advocating here. So again, maybe it ultimately comes down to a status question. Should the status of the state in innovation be raised or lower? As in, have we been undervaluing the role of the state? I think that the book is good. If one thing, I think maybe Matt Ridley, I think maybe he's the complete opposite. He thinks everything is like the state doesn't really do much. I think maybe if you put both things, both books together, maybe you get a nice summary. And just to finish off with one thing, so maybe one thing Mariana Matsukato doesn't really pay much attention to is like the political economy of all this stuff. If you give the state more power in deciding what should be funded, even things like taking equity in companies, becoming more of an investor, and we actually in practice would move more towards more of a planned economy style thing, which some sector of people may like. But in that case, you end up with this situation which you may not have intended, where the state ends up actually controlling the economy directly through ownership of its innovative corporations. And ultimately, ownership is power. Like if you own the media and you own the such corporations, you can use them. In theory, you could just say, "Oh, I'm going to use them just for the public good, and everything will be nice." But that doesn't always happen. And if you have this one entity doing all of that, then you effectively would have no escape.
Totally. So sort of in closing here, I want you to talk about, we've talked about a number of different topics, and it's amazing that you have such knowledge about all of them. I'm curious for the Jose production function. Why don't you talk about what it is that you think makes you sort of uniquely able to understand complex topics fairly quickly and be able to create compelling reports on them?
Yeah, I think that if you go back to the original production function in economics, right, like you're breaking things down in productivity, labor, and capital or equipment. Just like labor, it's like it's basically how do you maximize how much work you put into what you do. And here, I basically do things like I choose the flat where I live based on a spreadsheet, just so that I didn't have to commute. I can just walk to work. Well, now it's purely remote. I rarely cook anything. Everything's takeaway, so it's more time savings. I rarely go out. And so I mostly be able to basically just focus on doing this one thing and throw as much time as I possibly can at that, except for of course, my day job. But other than that, I mostly focus on doing this one thing. In terms of like capital, what equipment can you buy to help you with being effective at doing what you do? I think that to me, at least in my case, if you're sitting on a chair reading for a long time, it's exhausting eventually. Like maybe you don't feel like you want to keep doing that. Maybe your back hurts or something. So in that case, what I use to switch between the bed and a chair. So I bought this Chromebook, so I can actually keep reading and actually take notes on while I am sitting on the bed. It's like looking at a screen and flipping with touch screen. On the notes question though, so some people are pretty much into we may call them productivity systems. Are there ways of taking notes or tools to take notes, like Roam Research, for example? I don't use much of that. So I use Notion to compile papers that I've read, just so that I can search them. But I don't take a lot of notes, detailed notes about the individual things I'm reading at one specific moment in time. It's more I just keep reading through things. Initially, it's very superficial. You kind of like only retain vague, high-level things that you keep seeing these things over and over. So you think, these things must be important in this topic. So you focus more on those, and then as you continue, then you kind of get a better taste for what is relevant and what is not, and then you begin focusing on those. So I guess that initially, when I was looking at biology, the strategy I followed was, okay, when imagine that I tell you something like, with age, there is NAD depletion, and that causes a reduction in sirtuin activity, and that impairs DNA repair. Okay, what's NAD? What's sirtuins? What's this DNA repair stuff? So you get into all this like trying to understand each thing, each breaking down things into very small chunks and trying to deeply understand them. And by understanding, again, it's also I also have a model of what understanding means. To understand something, it means that you're able to do things like, again, it's more of a nebulous thing, but to be able to predict things. I think when you are reading more research, you see things coming because you have built this model of how things work in the field. You know what things are like the thing you're looking at. You know either what creates that thing or how it interacts with other thing. You know how the data that you're using to justify your beliefs was generated, and things like that. So I guess that ultimately that goes into the efficiency bucket, as in how do you make your hours count more? Because if you take 1 hour of Jose today and 1 hour of Jose last year, I'm given like the same time and the same equipment, I'm more effective right now at doing what I do, just because I've been building this structure for noticing what matters and what doesn't. Because you could, like, biology is such a kind of fractal thing. You could get lost in trying to understand this tiny detail of like this protein for years, but you will be missing the bigger picture. So it's the balance between how deep you want to go in your understanding and how broad you want to go, so you can actually notice what actually is connected to everything else, what matters, and so on. And for the notes, my belief is that if you really are interested in a topic, if you're committed to that for some time, you're going to be reading those papers, like loads of those papers over and over. That, in effect, is acting as a spaced repetition system. You're going to keep seeing the concepts by reading the papers themselves. And then by writing, I think the important bit is by writing the blog posts. I think most people, I'm sure, read papers and they form beliefs about them and stuff. But the thing that by writing them down, it's easier to both actually remember them, but most importantly, sometimes you think you know something, but you don't. As in, you have this, you believe that you believe something, but when you try to explain it to someone else, you're like, oh, I didn't really know how to explain this. So it means that you didn't really know, even though you felt like you did know. And writing really keeps you accountable. And finally, something else to try to do when I put these reports, these blog posts out there, ultimately, I'm trying to be accurate. I don't want people to be misled by what I write. And so I put bounties on them. So if anything I write is wrong, I will pay for the mistakes. So that depending on how serious the mistake is, I will pay more or less. If the whole thing is wrong, I think it's like $200. If it's a minor mistake, a little less. For example, when I published the longevity FAQ, Laura Deming sent me an email with a bunch of corrections. I think she got like 60. which was still expected. It was my first adventure into longevity, and Laura, of course, has loads more experience there. And I think that this is something that to me is like going beyond regular scientific standards, because sure, you can do peer review, but you can also actually claim that you're so sure that you are right that you're willing to put a bounty on it. This is something that some people are starting to. So there was a decision collaboration by Daniel Lakens and others, where they actually published a paper and put a bounty on the paper to find mistakes in there. And I think this is the same thing as prediction markets and other things, but putting money, if you really care about truth, if you're not just signaling that you are so smart and you can write complex seeming things, if you really care about truth, then you should actually have some skin in the game and put a bounty on yourself. And that way you will be paying for correctness. You will be buying truth from others they will come to you to make you more right and less wrong.
Totally. I think that's a great place to wrap. Jose, for people who want to go deeper, can you share your website and your Twitter?
Yes. So on my website is nintil.com. That's nintil.com. And my Twitter is at Artirkel. That's ARTILKEEL. Also, my Twitter is also linked there, and my website. And you can also just search my name, and you will probably come to my blog or my Twitter.
Yeah, perfect. Jose, this has been a lot of fun. My guest today has been Jose Luis Ricon Fernandez de la Puente. Jose, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.